The sunset painted the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, creating an atmosphere of magic. The girl rushed through the lavender field, where bright purple flowers stretched to the horizon, and lavender petals lightly touched her hands. The wind played with her hair, loose and light as clouds, and nearby the laughter of Eluana's daughter was heard. The little girl ran across a field strewn with delicate purple flowers, and a joyful smile played on her cheeks, and every step filled her heart with warmth and happiness, because ahead was her mother, to whom she so longed. Finally, ahead she saw the figure of her mother standing at the edge of the field, and the girl happily extended her arms to her mother, imagining how tightly she would hug her now. But suddenly her path to her mother was blocked by a metal grate that unexpectedly appeared, which separated them forever. The sunset painted the sky in bright colors, but instead of the usual delight, the girl's heart was filled with grief and anxiety. Mother left, she bowed quietly, and, without looking back once, walked away along the path drowning in purple flowers. The girl remembered the last look, but there was no forgiveness in it. While each slow step of her mother was like a blow to the heart of a little soul, the steps became quieter, and soon there were none left at all. The girl still sat, framed by the lavender field that had once brought her joy, but now it seemed endless and soulless. The flowers did not shimmer in the sunlight, but only remained silent, as if sharing her grief, and her mother left silently without turning around, leaving her daughter alone forever. The gates of the medieval castle, tall and massive, opened with difficulty under the weight of time. Every stone in these walls remembered the whispers of history, the many years of battles and sacrifices made in the shadow of its strong walls. The blonde girl Eluana lay on the cold stone floor of the dungeon, her hair like rays of sunlight scattered across the gray tiles, contrasting with the gloomy atmosphere around her. The walls, shrouded in dampness and shadows, held within themselves the sound of water dripping from the ceiling and the distant sounds of her heartbeat, reminding her that she was still alive, despite the hellish silence that reigned here. Her eyes, once full of hope and dreams, now reflected loss and sadness. The heroine woke up feeling very hungry, and seeing 2 portions of food, she hurried to divide them before little Louis woke up. She transferred almost all of her food to the baby's plate because she understood that the baby needed more nutrition than she did. Leaving some of the stew broth in her plate, the girl mixed it with water from the bottle, giving all of her food to the child. The heroine was very hungry, so she quickly drank some broth mixed with plain water from a plate to quickly satisfy her hunger. She woke up just in time because soon little Louis woke up too and looked at his little sister with frightened eyes. Eluana expected the boy to wake up soon, so she divided the food in advance so that he could eat right away. The caring sister gave Louis his double portion of stew and said that she was very hungry, so she ate alone, but the boy needed to eat the whole plate. Louis looked at his food and realized that his little sister was clearly hiding something from him because her portion looked completely different and consisted of only water. The boy was too smart for a child his age, so the little sister excitedly admitted that she was full because she drank too much water. After Louis had eaten a hearty meal, she suggested that he drink more water so that he would feel less hungry afterwards. At this time, one young man, together with his assistants, was heading to the settlement of Aden, and the heroine considered him a real scoundrel. The first prince of the kingdom, Regis Porton, always has a million reasons to kill people. He could kill a person simply because of the rain, or because he was in a bad mood, or because someone simply did not greet him, not paying due attention. Any little thing could cause this young man to kill anyone without blinking an eye. The prince stood near the dungeon where the young lady was kept with her younger brother, and considered this man a real madman. He tried to find out from the girl where Ronvita was now, and whether he still hadn't come to pick her up along with Louis. The heroine had no idea where her father was now, and he never had any plan, and there was no talk of a stronghold either. The prince asked if the girl was sure of her words because in that case he had no other choice, and warned that if she did not tell the whole truth, she would have to take all the blows on her shoulders alone. The heroine was never afraid of punishment, and was again ready to take all the blows for herself and her younger brother, even though her back was covered with huge bleeding wounds. But Louis saw his sister suffer every time, and this time he shouted loudly that he wished he could receive all the lashes himself so that his sister would not be in such pain anymore. The sister asked her brother to step aside, but the boy insisted on his decision and tried to stand up for her. The cold-blooded prince sighed and declared that this all looked too pathetic, and they needed to quickly decide who would receive all the lashes. The heroine insisted that this was not up for discussion, and the prince would not dare to beat his little brother. The young man grinned maliciously and asked his assistant to open the door immediately so that the criminal could receive her punishment. Her fair hair, disheveled and tangled, fell over her shoulders, but she did not pay attention to it. Her whole soul was concentrated on her younger brother Louis, who, trembling with fear, stood behind her. While the butler was trying to open the lock, the heroine raised her head and strength and fearlessness flared up in her chest. Even though the butler opened the lock every day, today for some reason the key, which always fit, would not turn in either direction. The prince wondered why the butler was still fiddling with the lock, but the young man insisted that it was strange, but the lock simply wouldn't open. Regis was famous for his cruel attitude towards people, so if something was done against his orders, he did not like it, and right now the butler received a whip right in the face. He called the young man completely useless and ordered that upon his return from the forest, the iron door of the dungeon be opened. With these words, he headed for the exit, leaving the butler alone, bleeding from the blow of the whip. The heroine watched what was happening carefully and saw how the butler suddenly started to run, and it seemed that he was not going to carry out the master's order. Eluana sat behind bars and was surprised when she saw that the butler immediately ran away after the master left. But the heroine was glad for one thing, that for some reason the young man was unable to open the lock now, and by pure chance she found herself safe behind the iron bars. Suddenly, hearing loud footsteps, she looked towards the exit to see who was heading to the prison. The young men were leading a young man, who was clearly unconscious, into the dungeon by the arms. Seeing a stranger being brought into the neighboring dungeon, the heroine immediately wondered who he could be and why he showed up here. The robbers threw the young man onto the concrete floor, slamming the iron bars shut and leaving him lying unconscious in the dungeon. The guards threw him down without bothering like a sack of straw and looked at each other, indifference reflected in their eyes. To them, he was just another prisoner, no one who could compete with their power. The main character's life was quite difficult, and her mother died on the day baby Louis was born. Louis's father died tragically in an accident, and after some time the young girl had no parents left. Therefore, she became Louis's only relative and the head of the family, whose duty it was now to protect her little brother. To survive with a growing child, the heroine took her father's name and began selling collectible swords and continuing the family business. The sword shop had many examples, among which was even a sword of the new, increasingly popular master Ron Vita, who had become famous throughout the empire. But everything was fine until one moment, and the problem turned out to be that this sword became too famous, and the prince had been looking for it for a long time and wanted to get it. One day, a red-haired young man came to the famous sword shop to the heroine, wanting to get that very special sword by any means necessary. The young man looked at the display case for a long time, and finally his gaze stopped on Ron Vita's antique sword. He turned to the girl and suggested comparing this sword with the king's to verify the authenticity of the rumors. The heroine was perplexed as to how his sword could be better than the one created by the dwarves themselves, and only they could create the most amazing sword. The prince swung his sword, but the next second he was convinced that the rumors were indeed true. And the girl saw with her own eyes what this unique sword, created by hard-working gnomes in the distant caves of the dungeon, was capable of. After one blow, the king's sword shattered into two pieces, and the young man was left standing with only the handle in his hands. Eluana had never seen anything like it, and she screamed loudly in surprise as she saw the king's sword shatter into two pieces. Even the prince himself was extremely shocked, and thought that it was definitely some kind of magic spell. He shouted that the king's sword could not break so easily, and probably the girl dared to deceive the prince himself, claiming that the sword was unique. It is for this reason that the main character, along with her younger brother, found herself thrown behind bars in Prince Regis's dungeon. That day, he ordered that the innocent girl and her brother Louis be thrown into a cold dungeon and locked up until he wanted to let them out. All this time, the girl was in the dungeon with her younger brother, but this morning the guards brought in a young man whom she had definitely never seen before in Aden. Looking closely at the stranger who was thrown into the dungeon opposite, the heroine could not understand whether he was alive or already dead. It took several minutes for the young man to begin to come to his senses. He could feel the cold stones beneath him. Every nerve in his body was tense, but there was still determination in his soul. The young man realized that one of his partners had betrayed him, and as a result he had been poisoned, so he had a maximum of 3 days to neutralize the poison. The vague images, like clouds, slowly dispersed, and he realized that he was in captivity, in a dungeon full of fear and despair. Seeing that the prisoner had woken up, Eluana immediately asked what the young man was doing in the dungeon, since he was definitely not from this city. The young man said that he had been kidnapped, but was surprised that the girl clearly understood that he was definitely not from around here. There weren't even 100 houses in Aden, and the lady knew only 6 people her age who lived there, so she quickly guessed that the young man was clearly not from here. The young man grinned and said that he had definitely been wrong to trust his friend, because of whom he ended up here. Eluana was indignant when she heard the stranger's words, because her opinion was completely different. The heroine asked excitedly what was wrong with trusting people, because that is what human nature is, and she was sure that the young man clearly had no idea what real trust was, since he dared to speak like that. The heroine understood that the young man had been betrayed by his good friend, so she promised that if she managed to find his friend, she would definitely tell him that he had acted extremely wrongly. The young man realized that the captive was clearly on his side, so she called her name Khazar and asked what the name of the fair-haired lady was. Eluana seemed to sense that the stranger was probably a good person and had ended up here by the same accident as she had, so she respectfully said her name and introduced the young man to her little brother Louis. The young man immediately realized that Ron Vita was the author of The Shining Deadly Night and The Quiet Dark Sun, and Eluana admitted that he was indeed her father. And Khazar asked if the girl was an aristocrat and belonged to the famous Vita family, but for some reason was in the prince's dark dungeon. But that was not the case, and even if Eluana was an aristocrat, she could still be taken into custody, and that was why she was here. Gradually regaining consciousness, Khazar felt that despite all the gloom of this place, hope was still in him. Suddenly they heard someone enter through the main entrance of the dungeon, and this meant only one thing. Someone is probably heading to the dungeon, and the prisoners are clearly in for a quick meeting with a stranger. 2 young men were walking down a dark corridor, and their partner just that morning couldn't open the lock on the iron grate. This time, 2 assistants went into the dungeon, and they, taking the weapon, understood that if they could not open the lock now, then they would definitely be in trouble with the prince, and it was unlikely that everything would end with just one lost eye. Eluana hugged her brother so that he would not see the strangers who had come and would not be scared, and she herself looked at the young men with frightened eyes. Holding it in his hands, the stranger asked the heroine to move away from the bars, and at that moment the lady was really afraid that she could simply be killed now. She understood that she would have to endure all 18 lashes, because this was not the first time the prince had cruelly abused her. But Eluana knew one thing: she would hate herself forever if little Louis also received lashes. While the boys tried to open the lock, Eluana prepared herself for the worst outcome, but knew that she would do anything to protect Louis. Eluana closed her eyes and heard the sound of the lock opening, and realized that she would probably be taken out and sent to the prince. Eluana concentrated. Turbulent emotions filled her soul. She knew that she had to do this right now. Her hands squeezed Louis tightly, and in this calm moment she felt the magic awakening inside her. She opened her eyes, and the horror of her anticipation gave way to delight as the bars slowly began to stretch out, turning black and turning into bizarre shadows that, like deceptive silhouettes from dreams, danced in the air. Her magic merged with the surrounding darkness, and these shadows twisted, obeying only her will. The shadows, having taken on a new form, began to separate the bars, clearing the way to freedom, and instantly lifted the youths into the air, tightly squeezing and wrapping around their bodies. At that moment, she realized that not only her magic, but also her love for Louis, was the force that could break even the strongest barriers. Everything that happened turned out to be incredible, and Khazar watched in fascination as the black writhing shadows that had recently been ordinary bars. But he saw with his own eyes how the rods turned into black magical entities, and Eluana could probably get free. The younger brother looked up at her, his eyes full of hope and fear at the same time. Eluana felt a strong flow of energy that was now heading towards them. She asked Louis not to worry and promised that they would definitely get out of here anyway. With a loud crack, the iron fell apart, and shadows shining in the semi-darkness opened a wide passage. Eluana pulled Louis along with her, Khazar ran alongside, and they climbed out of the dungeon, leaving fear and despair behind. Eluana was in such a hurry to get out of this terrible place and save her brother that she didn't notice how she accidentally ran and tripped. She would have obviously fallen with a crash onto the concrete floor, but fortunately, a young man managed to grab her hand and also ran away with her. The heroine thanked Khazar for not letting her fall and saw the frightened eyes of the young man. As soon as they were free, the first thing the Baron did was ask the girl if she knew alchemy, judging by what he saw. Eluana was surprised and asked what he meant by the word alchemy. The girl heard it for the first time. The young man was sure that she couldn't have the ability to use alchemy unless she had a special family. She was sure that the trick with the rods, which magically turned into ominous shadows, was definitely not performed by her. Also, it definitely couldn't have been the heroine's little brother who did this, and she was absolutely sure of it. The boy was still very young, and his strength would definitely not be enough to use such strong magic. Looking at little Louis, Khazar was convinced that the child definitely could not use magic. Eluana assumed that the young man was probably a wizard, and was delighted, since it was the first time in her life that she had met a wizard. But Khazar continued to insist that he was not involved in magical tricks, and even if it were magic, he would not have known. The heroine admitted that it didn't matter who did it, and they just needed to run away from this terrible place so that they could finally be completely safe. She carefully picked up her younger brother and went forward, and Khazar saw the girl's bloody back and was horrified at how many trials she had to endure. The girl's entire back was covered in huge, bloody cuts, which were so deep that they even had time to heal. But Eluana was desperate to save her younger brother and admitted that she didn't really want to die here. Khazar asked if these deep cuts were really the work of Prince Regis, since it was obvious that no one else but him would have dared to do such a thing. She said that indeed, only the prince was to blame for what happened, and the lashes were entirely his fault. The young man trusted this unknown girl, and taking her brother in his arms, asked her to take him and decided to carry the baby himself so as not to constantly stop along the way. He understood perfectly well that he was forced to help the young girl, who had already experienced all the pain and despair in the dungeon. Louis was not at all afraid of the stranger, and happily hugged Khazar, sitting in his arms. He understood perfectly well that his sister would not be able to move if the boy was constantly in her arms. So Louis trusted the unknown young man, and felt that he would definitely not do anything bad to him. They headed up the stairs, and there would probably be soldiers guarding the passage at the top, but Eluana was sure it was usually empty, and there probably wouldn't even be at least a few of the favors the prince had brought along. Khazar did not understand how this was possible. Even if the town's population was too small, there still had to be security. Eluana was right, and there was absolutely no one at the door upstairs, and now they had to get out of the bad place. There were only a few steps left to freedom, and a huge iron door separated the heroes. There really was no one after the door, but looking at it, Eluana had absolutely no idea how they could open it. Khazar approached the door and tried to do something, and the next second Eluana couldn't believe her eyes. The young man calmly opened the door, and the heroine asked again if he was a wizard, but he insisted that the door was simply open. Eluana was delighted, and stated that she would keep it a secret, and that she was probably only able to escape thanks to the dark-haired stranger. The heroes finally got free and found themselves in a labyrinth, but Eluana was incredibly happy that she managed to save her little brother and escape. The girl confidently approached the nearest bushes as if she knew exactly where the exit was. The exit really was there, and Khazar was incredibly surprised because Eluana was going exactly where she knew. The girl said that Louis used to walk here, and one day she had to run to catch him. The night's starry sky stretched overhead like a boundless sea strewn with jewels, and every moment when the gaze wandered over this endless dark canvas, there was a feeling that the stars were whispering their ancient secrets. They managed to escape through a secret passage in the bushes that only Eluana knew about, and finally, all the heroes were truly free. Khazar immediately asked the lady where she planned to go next, since they would probably be looked for. Eluana replied that they could no longer walk on the main roads and needed to move through the forest, so they needed to stop for a while near the old house. Khazar understood that it was not at all safe to go alone now, so there was nothing wrong with keeping Eluana company for a while. They approached some building, and Eluana, without fear, opened the door and said that she would return soon. Entering the house, the heroine saw that there was complete chaos inside, and that something had probably happened here. It was her house, and the heroine knew where the jewelry was kept, so she opened the safe, where her mother's necklace and a bag of gold lay, the sale of which could have kept them going for another couple of years. Eluana took her mother's necklace with her because this thing belonged only to her. In the box lay an incredibly beautiful gold necklace with a pendant in the form of delicate petals and a huge green gemstone in the middle. Eluana put the necklace around her neck so that she would never lose it, and was glad that the family heirloom was in her possession. When she opened the bag of coins, she realized that there was no need to take all the gold coins. So I decided to take only 20 gold coins and put the rest back in the safe just in case. She took all the most valuable things from the house, her mother's necklace and a bag of gold, and these savings, in her opinion, should be enough for several years. The lady also decided to take with her a jar of medicine that helps with many illnesses, and she could clearly need it. Taking with her all the essentials, the lady proudly walked out of the house, and she knew only one thing: these people hide until they come of age, and then they will bear their swords again. The young man stood not far from the heroine's house in a field of lavender, and in the darkness of the night these purple flowers incredibly fascinated him. And now Eluana was associated in his mind only with a huge field of lavender, and when he thought about her, only one place came to mind. In the estate of the Duke of Spes lived a unique man who possessed knowledge of alchemy, which was a combination of blood and innate talent of the Spes family, the strongest in the empire. Khazar suddenly heard her name and finally saw Eluana next to her, who had returned from the building nearby. The girl presented Khazar with a sword and asked him to take it as a gift, realizing that he would definitely need the weapon in the future. It was the very sword made by Ron Vita that the prince had been so desperately hunting for, but still had not gotten. For the young man, this was an incredibly valuable gift, and he accepted it with pleasure, and this sword had special significance for him. Holding the bag of gold in her hands, Eluana looked at her little brother with concern, realizing that they were finally provided for and could live peacefully in the future. She hung a small bag of gold coins around the boy's neck so that he would have some of his savings with him, just in case. But she told her brother that she was really having a hard time and asked little Louis to help his sister. Through the lavender field, the heroes had to go through a mysterious path through the forest, and Eluana was ready to lead everyone. They had just set out on their journey when they suddenly noticed something strange and paid attention to it. The heroes stopped, and Khazar clearly saw that there was someone standing in front, and the frightened Eluana turned in the other direction. At the edge of the bushes, casting a deep shadow, stood a mysterious figure. The figure was short, its outline slightly dissipated in the darkness, but against the background of the moon it seemed especially ominous. The shadow looked relentless, as if it was waiting for the moment when the heroes would get close enough, holding a huge axe in its hands. Khazar bravely approached the stranger first, leaving the lady and her little brother behind. He took out the sword that Eluana had given him, and before they could leave the house, it came in handy. But in an instant, all the fear developed when the man they saw called the Liana by name and smiled politely. The heroine was delighted to see her good friend Mr. Sam instead of the robber. The man asked excitedly what had happened to Eluana and Louis, as he had recently heard that they had been sent to prison. With a gesture, she showed Sam that he needed to say nothing, and soon she would tell him everything herself. The man realized that he shouldn't tell anyone that he saw the runaway girl with her younger brother. He himself asked Eluana to leave immediately so that they would not be caught by any of the bandits who would probably be looking for those who had escaped from captivity. Eluana sincerely thanked Mr. Sam because he was her good, long-standing, and very reliable friend. Khazar realized that Mr. Sam was probably a good friend of Eluana's, and he was sure that he would not tell anyone that he saw them. Mr. slowly walked into the forest, holding a sharp axe in his hands, which at first incredibly frightened Khazar. The young man asked if he would just let them go, even though they were fugitives, but Eluana told a story about how during a drought, her mom and dad gave away all the food, and before her, no one had died of hunger, so their family is special to the locals. Khazar was afraid that it was no longer worth trusting other people so much, but Eluana was sure of the opposite. She replied that trusting someone is not bad at all, but the one who betrays the trust of another is bad, and even though she had only known Khazar for a short time, she admitted that she trusted him. Gesturing to the side, Eluana explained that if they went there, they would see a path to the side area. The heroes needed to cross the road and go along the other side of the forest, but with each passing minute, Eluana felt more and more tired. All this time she held on bravely, because she knew that she needed to save her brother, but the girl had no strength left at all. She felt as if her back was on fire and wondered if this was her limit, but the strange thing was that the girl suddenly smelled something burning. Turning around, she saw the forest ablaze with fire, with huge clouds of smoke swirling around. She shouted at Khazar to run immediately. The forest behind them was ablaze, and the fire was coming straight here. The young man saw a fire in the distance and could not believe his eyes, but he realized that they urgently needed to escape. As soon as he turned around, he saw that the fire had already engulfed another part of the forest, and they found themselves in a cruel, fiery trap. Everything in front was also ablaze with fire, and Eluana suggested going towards the river, which should be nearby. They broke into a run, breaking their stride, and Eluana had to make every effort to gather herself again and move on, despite her extreme fatigue. The river flows through the kingdom of Valois, and it will be more convenient to escape from the kingdom than to head to neighboring territories. But one thing still haunted Khazar, and all his thoughts were occupied with only one thing. If these people started the fire in order to corner them and chase them down to the river, and it's probably just a trap. But the heroes had no other choice, and they had to solve problems as they came, and for now move forward. They stopped near the river, and Khazar assumed that if they stopped, they would be in the middle of the river and could easily be carried away by the current. Before the young man could finish these words, the heroes heard the clatter of hooves behind them, and this meant that the pursuit had finally caught up with them. Khazar shouted for Eluana to quickly jump into the water with him, but for some reason the girl remained standing on the shore. Carrying the boy on his back, Khazar was sure that Eluana was following him, so he tried to look only forward. But as soon as he turned around, he saw that Eluana was still standing on the shore, and it seemed that she was not going to go with them at all. He shouted her name loudly, but the girl was already pretending not to hear them at all, turning her back. She turned around and looked at Khazar, and only now did the young man understand her insidious plan, and she initially wanted him to save her younger brother. He only saw the girl take out her sword and prepare for battle, and he, standing in the water, understood that he and Louis needed to move forward. Eluana ran desperately towards the young men on horseback and was ready to pounce on any of them so that they would in no way interfere with the escape of Khazar and her brother. The girl bravely fought off 3 young men with her sword, and only thought about how incredibly scared she was at that moment and how much she missed her dad. Eluana wanted to grab at least a little time so that Khazar could run away while she dealt with the young men. But the forces were clearly on the side of the majority, so soon the young man grabbed the girl with the sword. One of them grabbed her by the arm, and the sword flew out of Eluana's fragile hand, leaving the girl completely unarmed. Louis saw how her sister was grabbed on the shore, and he reached out his hands to her, not wanting to go anywhere from his beloved little sister and part again. Khazar knew that the girl would certainly be captured, but he had a completely different mission, which she herself personally asked him about, and this mission was to save his younger brother. He heard his younger brother continue to give his sister, and Khazar's heart was incredibly squeezed with pain and despair. Eluana found herself trapped in the dungeon again, where cold air seeped through cracks in the stones. The floor was cold and damp, and her body, exhausted from long days on the run, felt heavy and lifeless. A faint light was shining through the lattice door, casting vague shadows on the floor, and the heroine thought that she was left completely alone. She really wanted Khazar and Louis to be saved because she did everything possible for this, and again found herself in captivity for the sake of her brother's freedom. She was put into another dungeon, and the heroine saw that the shape of the previous grate remained in the same distorted state. Eluana didn't deny it when she was accused of using magic, and she felt like her head was flying off her shoulders. Every time she thought about how to escape from this dark fortress, a spark of hope flared up in her heart. Gathering her last strength, Eluana sat up, leaning against the cold wall. Her arms were weak, but the desire to get out of here and restore justice became her only motivation. But she was very afraid that if she didn't get out of here, she would feel incredible guilt towards her parents because she left Louis alone. Eluana cried and did not understand how after her death Louis could live on his own, because she was his only hope, and now she was again in a dungeon from which she was unlikely to escape. As soon as leisurely steps were heard nearby, Eluana stood right next to the bars, waiting to see who she would see. Before her stood a noble aristocrat in a white jacket and red cloak with light amber eyes. The lady seemed to be enchanted by this blonde man, and she tried to remember because his face was already familiar to her. The heroine had seen this man before in a portrait that was painted by her mother, and it seemed she knew who was standing in front of her. Eluana frowned and really didn't want to see this man, much less talk to him while in the dungeon. The young man came here for only one thing, so he immediately asked where Ronvita's unique sword was. Eluana confidently replied that she didn't know where the magic sword was, and that the young man knew that her mother's name was Stella. If you think about it, this man was familiar with the heroine's mother, and she wanted to know who was standing in front of her. The young man did not hide the truth, and in a slow voice said his name, Tarudo Devon Spess. The heroine was already familiar with this surname, and she frantically began to sort through thoughts associated with this family. If this was the same Count Spess who ruled the entire south, then he was part of a family of alchemists whose influence was comparable to the imperial family. The lady admitted that she knew the young man's name and that she knew important information. The young man admitted that Eluana had the same sweet, gentle, and pleasant voice as her mother. Suddenly, the young man confessed that he was probably her real father, and the heroine had a lot to learn. Eluana had not expected at all that a stranger calling himself her father would appear in front of her, and the girl had absolutely no idea what was happening. In a cozy room filled with the aroma of freshly baked bread and herbs, Mother sat on an old wooden chair, and Eluana, her little daughter, nestled comfortably on her lap. Suddenly, little Eluana wondered if her mother loved her father, and even at such a young age she already wanted to know. The mother smiled, and her heart filled with warmth as she looked at her sweet daughter. Eluana listened with bated breath, absorbing the warmth and care in every word of her mother, feeling safe as if in a fairy tale world where there were no worries or sorrows. She truly loved this young man, perhaps even more than herself, but one day he still left. And after their meeting, a little girl, Eluana, was born, who became the real meaning of life for her mother. Only the melodic voice of the mother was heard in the room, and outside the window, the evening quietly covered everything around with its soft blanket. At that moment, it seemed that time had stopped, and the world was full of love and magic. Suddenly, Eluana asked if Mother missed her lover, and she was very surprising with her questions. The lady missed this man incredibly because they once had a very pleasant and warm relationship. She confessed to her daughter that she would always miss this man who had left a permanent mark on her heart. She promised to miss him until the day her eyes closed forever and could never see him again. Soon, Eluana had a younger brother, Louis, but her mother, unfortunately, did not survive the difficult birth. Immediately after Eluana's biological father left, her mother began living with another man, who became the father of Eluana and Louis. While going through her things, the girl found a photograph of a fair-haired young man in a box and wondered when she saw it. She asked the father, who was holding his newborn son in his arms, who the stranger in the photograph was. The young man came up to the girl and told her that this was actually her biological father, who had probably passed away some time ago. This man from the photograph looked at the girl with someone else's eyes, and she could not believe that the unknown young man was her real father, who during all this time never once asked how his daughter was doing, who he had never needed all her life, and standing in the dungeon, Eluana was sure that her father had been dead all this time, and how could he be alive and moreover standing in front of her? Count Spes then abandoned her mother and the Liana when she was a baby, because if a count has an illegitimate child, it is a disgrace to his entire family. And now, right in front of her stood her real father, who had never once taken care of his daughter in his entire life. But now he apparently needed something. Eluana rudely asked why he had come to meet her and what questions he might have for her. Suddenly, the young man looked at his hand and put it right to the lock, but there was definitely no key in his hands. His palm was illuminated by a bright light, and the lock began to make a strange sound, as if it was starting to open. The young man used magic and thus easily opened the lock, for which he did not even have a key. The lock opened with ease, and Eluana couldn't believe her eyes, because no one could open this lock before his arrival. She looked with surprised eyes at the opened lock that separated her from freedom. The young man slowly opened the prison bars, and the heroine stepped over the threshold, instantly finding herself free. But she was afraid to take even a step, because she had absolutely no idea what to expect from the stranger. Suddenly, the young man extended his hand caringly and asked her to go with him, promising that he would definitely help her. Eluana didn't know where this man was calling her, so she immediately asked why she should go with him. The young man replied that the reason was simple, and that he was her father, and Eluana could not believe that this was really happening to her. She didn't understand why her father showed up right now, because if he begged for something, it could not be returned. The young man replied that he had not abandoned his daughter, and she had no idea what had really happened. Now was not the best time to sort things out. The heroine needed to get out of this damned place and find her younger brother Louis. She asked him to get her out of here, and then she would be able to take care of herself and never bother him again. The young man knelt down in front of the girl, and it seemed she wanted to say something very important. He revealed that the sword, the broken sword of the Crown Prince, was not actually made by Ranvita. And as it turned out, the sword never belonged to Eluana's father, but to a completely different person. All the blades that were in Eluana's hands were created through alchemy and had immense, powerful strength. Today, the heroine learned many unknown stories about her past life, and everything was completely different from what she imagined. But it was alchemy that caused the bars of the cage to bend, turning into ominous black shadows. And now, Eluana understood why Khazar had asked her about some alchemy that she had never heard of. The young man asked if she was really ready to believe that a simple iron sword could break a sword made with an admixture of mithril, which, among other things, was specially forged for the royal family. Eluana slowly began to understand that her father probably came here because of her strong abilities. Probably the news that the prince's sword was broken by one unusual sword quickly spread throughout the empire. Eluana's father immediately realized that the lady could use alchemy, because the royal sword could not be broken by anything. Eluana asked excitedly if she could be of any help, since this young man probably didn't come here for no reason. The heroine asked to find her younger brother Louis and save him before something terrible happened to him. And if the young man accepts the boy with dignity and gives him everything he needs, she promised to help even more. The Duke did not understand what it meant to be useful, because he said that the girl could be justified in this situation. If she confirms that the sword was created by remembering alchemy, then the accusation of using magic will be dropped, and even the first prince will pay a high price for it. He said that he had thought about taking his younger brother before he came here, so the girl needed to go with him right now. For some unknown reason, Eluana somehow trusted this man, whom she had known for only a short time. She asked if he could really find Louis and bring him to her, and the young man swore on his name, promising to save his brother. Eluana really wanted to believe that he could really help her, because for the sake of her brother, she was ready to make any deal. The heroine decided to trust the young man who called himself her biological father, and felt as if she no longer had a choice. As soon as she turned her back to the young man, he immediately saw the huge wounds on the young lady's back, which were still bleeding. The young man asked menacingly who dared to raise a hand against her, and was clearly very unhappy that there were traces of wounds on his daughter's body. Lost in her thoughts, Eluana did not understand at all what the Duke was talking about and asked him again. He said that he noticed huge wounds on the girl's back, which definitely could not have appeared out of nowhere. Eluana did not hide the truth, and told that it was the first prince who punished her with a whip. Little Louis slowly opened his eyes and felt the warmth and rays of the sun coming through the roof of the building. Through the dilapidated roof, the rays of light shone directly on the boy, and he looked in fascination at the beautiful blue sky. Louis jumped up as soon as he woke up and shouted for his little sister, because he really wanted her to be near him. Looking around, he remembered that he and Khazar had hidden in this hut, and his little sister had been captured and taken prisoner. Khazar lay nearby and was still fast asleep, and probably needed a long rest, because he had been carrying the boy in his arms all this time. From now on, Louis began to call this young man his brother, and slowly crawled towards him to check whether he was sleeping or not. He excitedly touched Khazar on the arm, asking if he was sleeping or not. The boy touched his forehead, which was cold, which meant that the young man definitely did not have a fever. But Louis was afraid that his brother might die, but he really wanted him to be alive. After carefully examining the hut, Louis had no idea where he was, but he knew he had to save his little sister. Suddenly, Khazar whispered that he was still alive and was not going to die because he needed to save little Louis. The kid saw that Khazar was completely exhausted and couldn't even breathe. The young man admitted that he could not move his fingers, but he was sure that they were very lucky, and that their hand had brought them here he could not even light a fire. The young man was most worried that they might already be followed, but unfortunately he could do nothing. He asked Louis to go along the road that is behind him, and he should definitely fulfill this request. Little Louis should go to the village that is a day's journey from here and find an inn there, asking for help and using the name of Khazar. Khazar assured that Louis would have to hurry and go alone, and only he could save everyone. Louis was sure that he would definitely cope, and would certainly find the village and the help that his brother so needed now. He understood that the young man would be left here completely alone for 2 days if he went to look for help. He put some gold coins in his pocket and promised to return soon, asking his brother to be sure to wait. Khazar knew that the boy could handle this task, but he was very sorry that he couldn't help him in any way now. Normally, such a task would take only 1 day, but for a child, it will most likely take 2 days. Louis would have to flee without adequate food, and the boy was worried about whether he would be able to get there safely. And until he reached the place, he was sure that he would find a way to survive and cope with all the difficulties. Anxious thoughts began to torment him as soon as he was left alone, because he was sure that he was already causing trouble, and now he had been poisoned. The slave trader who had delivered him to hell was probably already tracking him down. Khazar wasn't sure he could hold out until Louis came to help, so he was already prepared for any outcome, as long as the boy was safe. Shortly before this, Duke Spes suddenly burst into the Imperial Guild and tried to find out from the prince about the whereabouts of the children. Regis insisted that the little boy had run away, and he had not seen where, and he could not say exactly where he was. He was sure that the sword in that shop was an alchemical one, but he was concerned about one thing: how could it have gotten there? Only a certain kind of spec can use alchemy, and only they are allowed to wield magical tools. He asked the assistant if there were any missing persons in this family, and if there were probably others he didn't know about. 38 years ago, His Majesty's uncle Sir Raiden left the family, and since then he has never returned. There is probably a chance that Ronvita is the son of Lord Raidon, and at the moment this chance is very high, because a few years ago the Vita family went bankrupt. The young man began to get confused, probably put the children and family of Spes in prison and beat them. Once the family went bankrupt, the head of Spes could buy out the name and call the children by other names. Khazar was able to cross the border and arrive in the kingdom of Valois, and the prince was already aware of this, and the assistant's children were already pursuing him, so good news should appear soon. The prince was sure that in any case, he would have to hand Khazar over to the princess, so he needed to make sure that the duke did not find the child who had escaped with him. This task had to be carried out secretly, and the young man warned his assistant about this several times. Suddenly, the butler entered the office and announced that Duke Spes had just picked up his daughter Eloana from prison and was now standing right outside the door asking for a meeting. The prince asked to invite the guests inside and expected that an interesting conversation would now take place. The duke burst into the imperial palace without warning, and the prince certainly did not expect to see him here today. The young man immediately said that he would like to ask the prince for a favor, and the servants quickly left without bringing him anything, but he needed the blood of the queen and the royal family. Instead of using the blood from the bow every time, one can use the image spheres installed in each royal building, but the young man admitted that he cannot use it temporarily without mana, and he wanted to use the sphere of the image, which is in the royal villa, and the prince happily allowed him to use whatever he wanted. They approached the magic ball, which was located in the main office of the imperial palace. The prince deliberately pricked one finger and directed his hand towards the surface of the shining magic ball. Suddenly, bright flashes of light enveloped the ball, and it began to tap as if it contained a living spirit. The prince asked loudly where the duke was, and probably with the help of the magic ball he was supposed to hear the answer. A voice was heard, which replied that they were located in the small town of Aden. In the future that the heroine imagined, she could never have imagined that her biological father would ever want to find her. She wondered if she found Louis and stayed with her biological father, would she have a sweet life in a room as nice as the one she imagined? This was the best-case scenario, and the worst-case scenario was that she would be married off for money as soon as she got to the palace. Eloana immediately decided that if she noticed even one hint of marriage, she would immediately grab Louis and immediately run away from her home. The deep cuts on the girl's back still hurt a lot, and the more she moved, the more they began to bleed. Recently, the doctor applied medicine to her, and she was finally starting to feel relief, and the pain was gradually going away, so Eloana immediately closed her eyes and fell asleep peacefully. A message came from the magic ball that, unfortunately, it would be quite difficult to deliver the priest to the estate by tomorrow morning. The young man stated that in that case, the duchy would no longer be able to support the temple in the future, which would probably not please anyone. After this message, the priest promised to try to be there before the clock struck 12 tomorrow. The young man warned that if the child was left with scars, he would cut the donation in half, and thus wanted to ask the priest for competence. At last, the duke had made the important call and was now assured of the information he needed. He thanked the prince for allowing him to use the imperial villa's communications facilities, and the young man admitted that he was glad to help. The blonde-haired hero said that he could never have imagined that he would find blood relatives in such a place. The duke was interested in whether their lineage came from his uncle, who left the family 30 years ago, so he had to check how he got the surname Vita. Perhaps someone bought their name since the family went bankrupt about 30 years ago. Prince Regis thought he was entirely right in putting this idea forward to the duke in conversation, but here he was sure that if he acknowledged Ron Witt as his blacksmith and held an official burial, then the sword that was created by Eloana would remain a secret forever. And not one person on the council will think that a 15-year-old girl made a magic sword. The young man asked what the prince was doing in such a place, and he admitted that he sometimes traveled and decided to rest a little. Apart from the imperial villa, there was nothing else to see in Aden, and if he thought about it, the young man couldn't understand why they had built an imperial villa there at all. The prince knew that if the duke began to inquire about the reason for the journey, he would find himself in a difficult situation. The Duke insisted that the Crown Prince had brought the precious sword here and broken it, but if he was wrong about that, then had he not previously been involved in betraying his niece? The young man insisted that it was just a mistake and that he knew absolutely nothing about it. And he has absolutely nothing to do with it, assuring that all actions are completely wrong. The prince knew that even the assassins of the imperial family were sent for the soul of the Duke, and there is a rumor that he is a monster who turned them into golden statues and put them in the garden. Suddenly, with a deft gesture, the Duke drew a magical purple sphere in the air, and inside it were gold coins. The magical whirlwind flew straight towards Prince Regis, and he was definitely unarmed against strong magic. At that moment, the ball opened and a whirlwind of mysterious light burst out of it. The magic ball flew around the prince from all sides and flew back into the hands of its master. The young man realized that real alchemy had just been used in front of him, and the magic belonged specifically to the Duke. He asked what he was doing and how he dared to leave his dagger with the prince himself. The young man smiled and answered what kind of dagger he was talking about, because in the purple whirlwind there was only a small button. In the Duke's palm, there was indeed a small gold button, which had probably come off the Crown Prince's suit. After a long conversation, the Duke realized that, since he had also miscalculated, it would be unwise to punish his niece. Regis was indignant. Did the Duke just decide that he could get away with everything and that he was allowed to treat him like that? In fact, up until this moment, the young man had in no way wanted to insult his interlocutor, but he probably could no longer tolerate his insolence. The young man admitted that he was curious about what the prince could do, and now he was only praying that this young man was not from the race of arrogance. The Duke stated that everything was in perfect order, and that he now needed to return to the Emperor, but he warned that he would soon visit the prince again. They had to decide on the inclusion of the Ranavid in the family register, and this was probably an important event that should be discussed with His Majesty. He was probably going to tell everyone that the first prince's sword was broken, so that all the aristocrats would finally know about it. The Duke said that in that case they needed to visit their niece, and he also wanted to ask for a favor. He asked the prince not to make a grave mistake under any circumstances, and not to interfere in the affairs of the Spes family. The Duke threw a couple of gold coins in front of him as a sign that the prince should understand his intention. He admitted that he is extremely concerned about the well-being of all family members without exception, so the prince will also not be left without due attention. As soon as the Duke left, Regis finally realized that the young man had dared to threaten him, or perhaps he had simply imagined it. Little Louis continued to run without looking back all this time. Now only in his hands was the salvation of Khazar. A carriage rushed past him at great speed, and the boy even stopped briefly so that it would not hit him. The boy sat down on the very edge of the road to let the carriage pass by, tiredly wiping the dirt off his face with his sleeve. Suddenly he saw little glowing balls above him, and immediately realized that they were telling him something. Louis had no idea what these glowing spheres were, but they had been following him from the very beginning of his journey, and it was definitely not a firefly. Suddenly Louis heard someone riding a horse approach him, and a male voice asked why the baby was there alone. There were 3 young men sitting on 3 horses, and one of them asked where the little boy was going without adults. Louis was still fascinated by the magical glowing entities, and did not even immediately pay attention to the stranger's question. The boy said that he was going to the village of Yanzu, and the young man offered to give him a ride for a small fee. Louis had a bag of gold coins hanging on his chest, and wondered if he should pay the stranger to take him to the village. Louis noticed that the rays of light would try to stop him, and under no circumstances would he go with these young men. He answered the stranger that he had no money at all, and that he was now heading to his dad. The young man asked again whether the boy really didn't have a single gold coin, and how his parents let him go for a walk without anything. They turned around and left, and Louis remained sitting on the road, surrounded by magical rays of light. The boy was very scared, but was incredibly glad that the strangers simply turned around and left. He immediately set off on his way again, but after a few minutes the carriage drove up to Kalui again. The coachman turned to Louis and said that this was why the boy would not encounter any settlements, and that he could probably have gotten the wrong way. The boy asked if this road really led to the Yanzo village, and fortunately it did, but the coachman was surprised if he really planned to go the whole way without his parents. In fact, Louis couldn't tell the truth because he was being followed, so he said that his father was wounded and he needed to get to his mother, who worked at the hotel. The girl sitting next to the coachman was afraid that the baby was probably in trouble, and since they were also heading to the village, he might go in the cargo cart. Louis was not at all afraid to ride with these people, and he sincerely thanked them for stopping and helping him. He sat down between the coachman and his wife, and finally, after a long journey on foot, he could rest a little, because the boy's legs were incredibly tired from running. Caring people gave the boy some bread, but even here, Louis divided the bread into 3 pieces to please his mom and dad. They brought little Louis straight to the hotel called the Counting Stars, which the boy had spoken about. Entering inside, the boy looked around excitedly and was immediately met by a respectable gentleman. He asked who such a young man, whom he had definitely never seen here before, was looking for. Louis said that his brother Khazar promised that they would be able to help him here, and the boy would be safe. The boy insisted that everything was completely unimportant, and the most important thing now was that Khazar was lying in a cold hut and could not open his eyes at all. The man looked closely at the boy and was sure that he definitely could not lie to him. He asked a brave little boy who had reached the village on his own to show them the way back so that they could finally save Khazar. Many hours had passed since Khazar finally came to his senses and woke up, lying on a soft, cozy bed. Moving his hand, the young man immediately realized that he was lying under a blanket, and this meant only one thing: he definitely could no longer be in that hut. Turning his head, he saw a sleeping baby Louis on a chair, who had been waiting for an incredibly long time for his brother to finally wake up. He stroked his head and said with care that such a brave little boy was able to cope with such difficulties, and he deserved a huge reward. When he woke up, the boy realized that Khazar had already woken up, and all this was only thanks to him. The young man realized that if it weren't for this brave little boy, he would probably have met death in that lonely hut. The boy happily ran to tell everyone that his brother had finally woken up and come to his senses. Khazar noted that the town of Adan was not so bad, but the flow of mana here was incredibly thin. A man entered the room and introduced himself as the manager of the hotel branch, named Monaf, asking how the gentleman was feeling. The doctor had already given the young man the medicine, but it seemed that it had not worked completely. Her soul assured her that he did not have the kind of friend that could be cured with ordinary medicine. Khazar asked for the most expensive carriage that could be found to be prepared, as well as 6 guards and clothing suitable for official meetings. He promised to leave immediately after providing these things, and the manager immediately realized that the young man was clearly in a hurry. He placed some gold coins on the table and said that they had been found in the young man's clothes as soon as he arrived. Louis just ran into his little brother's room, and it was he who left 5 gold coins in his pocket just in case. He carefully held a tray of soup in his hands and asked the young man to eat it, because he really needed to eat to gain strength. Khazar had no intention of refusing food, and the boy suddenly saw 5 gold coins on the nightstand. The young man smiled and asked if Louis had put it in his pocket before leaving to find help. Khazar thoughtfully suggested that the boy put the 5 gold coins back into the satin bag that his little sister had given him, and hung around his neck. The young man was very eager to get Eloana back as soon as possible, and said that they would be ready to leave in 3 hours. In any case, to receive proper treatment, he needs to return to the Empire. The boy really wanted the young man to help save his sister, and was very afraid that he would have to crawl through that dog hole again to get her out of the dungeon. But Khazar asked the boy not to worry about this, and not to be nervous, because this time they were going to go directly. The innkeeper also paid the coachman and his wife so that they would not tell anyone anything, and the meeting with this boy was a complete secret. On a small square stood a carriage, glittering with metal and elegantly decorated with carvings, and any minute now it was about to set off on a long journey. As soon as the carriage started moving, Louis looked out the window, and a multitude of emotions played out in his heart: fear, anticipation, joy, and a little sadness. In ancient times, it was said that the dragon presented a gift to the first emperor of Kandio, and the first of them was called the 3 Blessings. It made the empire an inviolable and sacred territory for 1,000 years, before which stood the magical gates of entry. While it is possible to leave the empire at any time, it is also completely impossible to invade it, and anyone who wishes to enter the empire's territory must pass through the entrance gate. Looking out the window, Louis immediately decided for himself that he would need to brag to his little sister that he had seen the magical entrance gate with his own eyes. Khazar wondered if Eloana was still alive, and he was sure that Regis was to blame for her imprisonment, and he would hardly take care of her wounds, but one way or another, the young man promised to pay for everything to the people who were involved in her kidnapping. Finally, the 4th prince of Khazar Argus Fortuna arrived with his assistants at the appointed place, where he was already awaited with respect. A young man came out to him and said that he did not know that His Highness was in the kingdom of Valois, but the young man confessed that he had carried out a secret mission and was now heading towards Adan. The young man opened the carriage and solicitously informed Louis that they could go, while the boy was worried that they had to wait their turn. The boy was surprised that his brother was really so rich that they could go everywhere without waiting in line, and smiling, Khazar replied that he really was a little rich. The baby didn't yet know that the most dear and beloved person was already waiting for him in the mansion, and it was his little sister, Eluana. Opening the door, he immediately saw his sister, and the boy could not believe his eyes, because his little sister was standing right in front of him, alive and well. He had waited so long for this moment when his brother would be able to hug his sister again. This meeting was long awaited, but just recently it seemed impossible. His sister Eluana was captured, and every moment of separation was like a sharp knife tearing his soul apart. Each step towards her seemed like an eternity, and then they met, hugging each other so tightly as if they were trying to merge into one whole, as if time and space had lost their meaning. His sister's voice trembled with emotion, and Louis realized that although they were separated, the ties that bound them were stronger than any barriers. They learned to appreciate every minute spent together, knowing that nothing could separate them again. Eluana, in turn, shared her experiences, the story of how she was able to maintain hope during the dark days of captivity, when it was especially difficult. The boy cried and promised his little sister that he would try to grow up quickly, but she should not die and leave him alone, so that they would always be together. The sun's rays were fading and the world around them was sinking into darkness, but in their hearts all the power of love and unity shone. Hearing quiet steps behind her, Eluana returned and saw another person she had been worried about for a long time. It was Khazar, who was finally standing right in front of her, looking at her with a sweet smile. The young man looked magnificent in an elegant, expensive suit, and holding out his hand, he asked Eluana to follow him, since they had come here specifically for her. Eluana was surprised that Khazar came here only to take her and her younger brother. She was afraid that Khazar had been captured by soldiers while they were looking for Louis, but the young man replied that no one had caught them, and that they were here only of their own free will. He took the girl's hand and asked her not to worry about the first prince, promising that if they walked out the front door, no one would be able to stop them anymore. The heroine assured that everything would be fine with her even if she stayed here, but Khazar certainly didn't think so. The very next second, the Duke who called himself Eluana's father appeared, and he was clearly unhappy with the appearance of the stranger. The Duke's eyes glowed with a bright light, giving off an atmosphere of despair and madness, and every glance he cast seemed to burn everything around him. Eluana shouted that Khazar could calm down, and that there was a good relationship between them and the Duke, and there was no need to be afraid of him. Suddenly, a magic ball appeared in his right hand. It glowed with a bright gold and green light, shimmering with all the colors of the rainbow. Suddenly, the ball began to vibrate, giving off energy that filled the room with fiery sparks. The ethereal form changed, and with a sharp click, the magic ball transformed into a dagger. Eluana stood before the Duke, declaring that she had been locked in the prison tower with Khazar, and that he had only come here to save them, and was not dangerous at all. It was something more, an unknown magic that was meant to protect or punish. The young man asked if the lady would be comfortable talking in the presence of this young man, since he clearly did not know much. A frightened Louis stood next to his little sister the whole time, holding her tightly by the hem of her dress in her hand. The Duke looked at the boy and admitted that he looked like a small copy of Ron Vita, and was very similar to his father. Eluana hadn't expected Khazar to show up here with Louis, but now this meeting was on a larger scale. The Duke asked in any case what His Highness the Fourth Prince was doing here, and why he was the one who went to save the vine. As soon as the girl heard that Khazar was the Fourth Prince, she gasped in surprise, because she didn't know this for sure. All this time she thought that Khazar was an ordinary young man, and all this time she communicated with him as an equal, but now it turned out that he turned out to be a respectable prince. The young man admitted that he had never thought that the lady would have to find out about it in such a situation, and he really wanted to tell everything earlier. But one way or another, now the heroine has learned the whole truth about the Fourth Prince, who still has not answered the question of the Duke, who wanted to understand what was happening. Khazar began to tell the story. It all started on the way back after observing the construction of a water canal at the Thane's estate. That day, the Sir gave him a drink with red fire added to it, which turned out to be poison, as a result of which the young man was poisoned. And according to rumors, there are some who are ready to spend a fortune just to endanger her life on issues known throughout the Empire. He was sure that there were people who dared to want the Prince of the Empire for their collection, killing him and then becoming famous. Khazar said that there is even one person here who was sold a long time ago. Now the Duke understood what the prince was doing in Adana, and he wanted to be in the front row when Khazar died after being poisoned. And clearly no one could help the prince if he drank enough red fire, and the young man still has no idea who could have done it. Now he felt much better, and besides, he had not yet fully recovered, but he had already taken the antidote, so everything should be fine in the future. Since the Duke knew that Khazar had significant reserves of mana, from what he saw, he could barely use a handful of what he had, and this proved that he was still poisoned. And even though the young man was on the verge of death, he still went to save Elwana in such a critical condition. Elwana understood that he protected Louis until the last, while the poison was slowly killing him, and even came to save the girl. All this time, the young man bravely tried to save the lady and her little brother, despite the fact that he himself was on the brink of death. Elwana sincerely thanked the young man for saving her, and admitted that if it weren't for his help, she and Louis would hardly have survived. Smiling, the prince replied that he, too, was incredibly grateful to the girl for her help, because she had helped him escape from prison. They had gone through difficult trials that had brought them closer together than they could have ever dreamed of, and Khazar, tired but still graceful, looked into Elwana's bright eyes, in whose gaze all the emotions they had gone through together were reflected: fear, hope, and finally confidence. The Duke stood between them and, noticing the young people's infatuation with each other, admitted that he would repay the family's children for helping them. Khazar said that if the Duke kept the news of his kidnapping a secret, that would be enough for the plan, although there was not a single piece of evidence for this, but there was something that the young man would have to clarify. Khazar wanted the Duke to answer him if there were any other people on the list who possessed magical abilities. He saw the sword created by Ranvita at an auction a couple of days ago, and the merchant came to collect his payment, and at the meeting the Duke learned that Ranvita had children. Khazar was not surprised, because with such abilities it becomes clear that the blood of Spes flows in their veins. The Duke admitted that Khazar was right, and these children were the legitimate representatives of his family. He was convinced that she was now safe and that he had no intention of being involved in the affairs of another family, so the young man chose to withdraw. The Duke finally asked whether Khazar should leave before he fully recovered, since he could find an antidote in the capital. But the young man did not require anything else. And finally, he turned to Elwana, giving his full name and confessing that if she needed help in the future, she could find him at any time. He asked little Louis to be sure to take care of himself, and also to take care of his older sister, who loves him very much. After saying goodbye, Khazar left the Duke's mansion and said goodbye forever to the girl who changed his life. This young man was indeed the fourth prince, and he had grown up constantly overcoming difficulties ever since the first prince decided to keep him in check. Elwana thought the first prince was a terrible person, and even if she had longed to take the emperor's place, she would never have touched her younger brother. She noticed that the Duke had used the phrase "my children" in conversation, and Khazar had also spoken about some children of the family. All this time, Louis looked at the tall, fair-haired young man and had absolutely no idea who he was. He remembered that he had seen this man in a photo before, and asked if this was Elwana's real dad, and the lady replied that from now on he would protect them. The Duke overheard the boy asking about him, and he probably should have met little Louis. He greeted the young man politely and called him the real father of his little sister, whom he was incredibly glad to meet. In the morning, a maid knocked on the heroine's door and informed her of the arrival of a priest, who had been sent because Elwana needed treatment. The young man thought that the Duke was so irritated, and it seemed to him that someone was seriously injured, but he saw a completely healthy girl in front of him. But as soon as Elwana turned her back and the healer saw her bloody wounds, everything became clear to him. He felt sorry for the young lady and couldn't believe that someone would dare to bully a young girl like that. The doctor used powerful healing magic to make the girl's wounds heal quickly and stop causing unbearable pain. In an instant, the skin on Elwana's back instantly healed and glowed, and not a single trace of the deep cut remained on her back. Elwana thanked the doctor, who examined her back and declared that the girl was now completely fine. She didn't even believe that her body could not hurt so much, because she had long been accustomed to severe pain, and she really appreciated the doctor's help. The young man bowed respectfully because his duty was to heal people, and he was happy to help anyone who needed it. Elwana noticed that the priest looked rather tired and wondered if something had happened. The young man said that he had passed through the teleporter the previous night and then, like a madman, had been running for 16 hours straight to get to this place. It was because the Duke had threatened to stop the donation that the priest had to travel so quickly. Eluana guessed that perhaps this priest was of high birth, but he had rushed here all night to heal her wounds. It seemed that Duke Spes had much more influence than the great prince, judging by the fact that the priest himself rushed at his request. The priest fell asleep right in front of this girl, and Eluana understood that the young man urgently needed to rest. But as soon as she had time to think about it, she saw how the priest fell asleep right sitting on the sofa during the conversation. Eluana carefully put the traveler to bed and covered him with a soft, warm blanket so that the young man would be comfortable. She quietly left the room and was sure that he definitely needed to rest. In the corridor, she met the venerable Duke, who was just heading to Eluana to check on her condition. The lady bowed and expressed her respect and gratitude to the Duke for his help. The young man asked how the treatment went, and the lady thanked him for her care, because after the treatment she felt much better. The young man planned to return to the estate by noon, but Eluana was probably feeling tired, so the Duke decided that he could stay here for another day. Eluana replied that everything was fine and that she was already feeling great, so she could handle Louis herself. As soon as the heroine thought that she would be left alone, it was as if a huge bell rang in her head, and she was left standing on the edge of the abyss. When the bell stops ringing midnight, Regis brings branches of the world tree and punishes the captives. Eluana remembered those terrible moments, so she felt that she was very afraid to be left alone. The girl continued to tremble and could not utter a word, and the Duke did not understand what was happening to her. The Duke noticed that she was not feeling well because her hands were shaking very badly. He wondered if the treatment had not been enough, noticing how Eluana's whole body was shaking and beads of sweat were appearing on her forehead. The young man asked to simply tell her that if the treatment was really mediocre, he promised to find another person who would definitely help her. Eluana continued to insist that she felt fine, but her condition worried her father. An ominous voice in her head said that the great prince would come after the bell struck midnight, and all this frightened the girl incredibly. The Duke understood that she was probably very afraid after everything that had happened, because all the terrible events had traumatized the girl. The young man tried to make it clear that the lady was safe and that everything was over, but Eluana still felt tense. The Duke fully understood her feelings and said that now the worst was behind her. He offered the girl a cup of hot tea, but suddenly she said that she and her brother could leave today and decided to take her leave. Eluana didn't turn around and confidently walked forward down the corridor, probably getting ready to leave. The Duke had no reason to hinder the young girl, and he also could not understand her intentions at all. Prince Khazar sat in a luxurious carriage, strewn with soft velvet cushions and decorated with golden patterns, and the road, winding through flowering fields and shady forests, was strewn with flower petals. But, despite all the beauty of the surrounding world, Khazar's thoughts were far from the ease of the situation. He looked out the window, watching the flickering landscapes, but could not see anything for real. His mind was occupied with questions that tormented him. In one place in the forest, he saw a small cluster of mana that still had tremendous power. And around the mana, luminous lights were circling, and Khazar felt as if they were blinding him. Little Louis could also see mana that day, but does that mean he can use magic too? The young man was tormented by many questions, but he was sure that in any case, the Duke would take care of this. Finally, the carriage pulled up to a huge mansion, near which stood young men talking to her about something. Seeing a small crowd of people and taking a closer look, Khazar realized that those young men were real magicians. For the first emperor, a lover of travel, a teleport was built next to the dragons, who were free as the wind. There were 9 of them throughout the kingdom, located everywhere, including the north, south, west, and east, and connecting the vast territories of the kingdom. Strategically, this teleport was incredibly important, and now Khazar saw 5 mages standing right next to the teleport. They were probably 3rd-level mages, but as far as the boy knew, a team of 5 mages didn't exist, and they weren't even wearing cloaks. The only thought that came to him was that these people could probably be from the Western Tower, but this opinion was also probably wrong. Ever since the dragon disappeared, the mana energy has been gradually depleted, and soon every mage who has not reached the 1st level will inevitably die. About 80% of all the mages were in the Eastern Tower, which was famous for producing magic stones and mana, while the mages in the Northern Tower were forced to use their powers to exterminate monsters. There were less than 100 people in that tower, and most of them were 3rd-level mages, and experiments to resurrect Mom were being conducted in that place. They used the mages for their own purposes and experimented on them, but because of the mages' principles, these people still remained unpunished. There must be some special reason why all these young men gathered near Aiden right in front of the magical teleport. As soon as the young men heard the creaking of the approaching carriage, they immediately fell silent and stopped talking completely. The young man quickly entered the center of the teleport and the next second disappeared into the blue fog. Khazar got out of the carriage and was greeted by the guards, who had been waiting for a long time for the arrival of the master. He immediately decided to find out where these young men came from, and one of the guards confessed that he had received permission to teleport from the emperor. This news was extremely unexpected for the prince, and so the emperor decided to act in this way without his knowledge. A gilded carriage sped along the winding forest roads, and inside it sat 3 people. Eluana gently stroked the hair of her little brother Louis, who was sleeping peacefully on her lap. His small face was calm, and Eluana couldn't help but smile as she looked at him. The boy was her joy and source of inspiration, because the time spent with him always filled her heart with warmth and peace. On the opposite side of the carriage sat a young man with blonde hair and a piercing gaze. Despite his youth, he exuded confidence and authority, which made him worthy of respect. The lady wondered how her relative would react if she told him about Louis's father's death. She was afraid that things would take a turn for the worse, and she would have to run away with Louis immediately, so she told him that her father had been in a carriage accident last year. All this time she was trying to make a living, so she took a sword from the forge and sold it under her father's name. Eluana said that there were so many merchants in Aden that they couldn't catch her, and those around her only helped her with the sale. After listening to the girl's story, the young man realized that she had to go through a lot at a young age. She had already gone through enormous pain and mental suffering. He asked the girl not to worry anymore, promising that in the future she would never again encounter terrible events that could harm her health. The heroine was sure that the Duke would be angry because she used her father's name, but to her great surprise, he didn't even say anything. Eluana watched the young man, feeling how his presence filled the carriage with an atmosphere of calm. He asked the young lady with concern if she was tired, as she might probably get seasick from the long journey. Smiling, Eluana replied that she was feeling much better and that the priest was really very good, and that the scratches on her hands also healed quickly. The young man was glad to hear good news, and they were supposed to arrive soon, but since they were traveling by carriage, they got there very slowly. The lady was not at all embarrassed by the long journey, and baby Louis slept on her lap the whole time. The Duke asked a question about magic and wanted to know how much Eluana actually knew about it. The girl replied that she believed that the leaves could turn golden with the help of magic, and only now did Eluana realize that she could have probably thought of this earlier, because she could turn any leaf into a gold bar and become rich. The young man noted that the girl was quite resourceful, and that the leaves could also be turned into an elixir of immortality. He said that if you touch the materials yourself, you will have to pay a high price afterwards. In magic, everything was not so simple, and powerful techniques could cost vital energy. Eluana now realized that her dreams and wealth were not destined to come true, because every such action was punishable by years of life, and thus she would only become a rich old lady. The Duke also announced that they often resonate with their correct material, but the lady did not understand at all what he was talking about. Each magician had his own specific substance, and the Duke's substance was real gold. With the help of magic, he could create a real hare and even a living golden bear. With one light movement of his hand, the young man created a golden bracelet on Eluana's fragile wrist. The bracelet looked incredibly beautiful and shimmered with golden hues, and could even take any shape. The Duke said that with a little magic, he can also create magical items that might be needed for security. But there is one rule. When you change the shape of a material, it takes away the energy of the magician who creates this object. The Duke asked if the girl felt her heart beating much faster while she was melting the swords. According to the young man, this is the very resonance, and the more ordinary the form, the stronger the resonance effect. Surely Eluana had already felt how she resonated with the sword, but then she didn't want to hurt anyone at all. Good mages always rely more on knowledge than on strength, and the young man promised that as soon as they arrived, Eluana's training in magical basics would begin. She asked if she would need to undergo magical tests before the principal to confirm his words. But only members of the Spies family can use magic. If the Duke recognizes it as being due to a family member, then such a test will not be required at all. The Duke said that he would first declare Ronvita a member of the Spes family, and after that it would be possible to say that she had inherited her father's abilities. Even though the family has lost its significance, Ronvita is still considered a significant person, and the use of his name is quite strictly punished. This man has already done a lot for Eluana and his brother, so she will no longer be called the illegitimate daughter of the Duke, and she will be able to live as the daughter of her father, as the daughter of Ron Vita. Eluana understood perfectly well that this would be better not only for her, but also for little Louis, who had a wonderful, bright future ahead of him. The lady bowed and thanked the young man for his help, because it was he who helped the girl escape from captivity. Eluana admitted that she would like to take Louis with her, and the young man smiled and replied that she was acting as if they didn't know each other. He asked if this cute child was Stella's son, because he also wanted the truth. The baby rubbed his eyes and smiled, his face glowing with joy, and he was always delighted to have his little sister nearby. The carriage stopped near a luxurious mansion, which in the light of the sunset rays seemed simply incredibly beautiful. Eluana couldn't help but be amazed at how big the mansion was, and it was Louis's first time in such a place. The boy smiled and admitted that he was very glad that they found themselves in such a wonderful place, because the house looked simply wonderful and huge. The Duke asked his sister and brother to follow him to show him the surroundings and the mansion itself. He offered his hand to the girl to help her out of the carriage, and this was the first time in Eluana's life that this had happened. She knew that she could easily get down on her own, but the rules of etiquette required it, and the Duke probably just wanted to help her. But now it didn't matter, and in any case, these people would soon have to get closer, living in the same house. And so Eluana carefully offered her hand to the Duke, believing that she was stepping into a new bright life. His hand was warm and very pleasant, but Eluana still felt a little constrained. The Duke approached the carriage and also wanted to help the boy get down, but Louis looked at him and did not understand what he needed to do. The Duke instantly picked up the boy in his arms and helped him down the carriage so that he would not trip on the high step. Now the lady stood next to her brother in front of the huge, luxurious house in which she was to live. She took little Louis by the hand and, with excitement, became a little confused as she continued to follow the Duke. But suddenly the butler ran up to them shouting that the dear Duke had finally arrived, and everyone had been waiting for his return for so long. He ran up to the boy and was surprised at what a wonderful little boy was visiting here and greeted the young man. The butler also couldn't hold back his sincere emotions when he saw the cute blonde lady, and he probably knew who she was. This emotional young man's name was Noah Nilsson, and he was the Duke's responsible assistant, who was incredibly happy to meet him. The young man leaned over to the boy and said that he couldn't believe how quickly he had grown up and how incredibly quickly time passed. The butler was worried that Eluana had suffered for a long time while in captivity and admitted that his heart could now. The Duke asked Noah to stop the emotional performance and asked everyone to finally go inside. As soon as the head butler and the head maid came out to the Duke, ask him what he was going to do first, have lunch or take a bath first. Upon hearing about the hot bath, Eluana immediately said that she would love to go to the bath first and relax. The caring maid asked the girl to follow her, as the water had already been prepared. Eluana settled comfortably into the hot tub, immersing herself in the waves of warm water that embraced her tired body, a pleasant warmth spreading across her skin, driving away the remnants of tension and fear that had accumulated in the dark corners of her confinement. But most importantly, now when she touched the water, her back did not hurt at all because her skin was now healthy without cuts. The water playing on her skin seemed to wash away the memories of pain and suffering, leaving only bright moments. She closed her eyes and enjoyed the fact that she felt free again. Every breath brought her joy, and every splash of water coming out of her hands reminded her of how important it is to appreciate the little things, the simple moments that previously seemed banal. And now, lying in the hot water, she felt her heart filling with hope and a thirst for life. But with every moment she loved freedom more and more. The heroine wondered if her life would improve now, because she really wanted her and her brother Louis to just live happily and be safe. As Eluana sank into the hot bath, she felt the water embrace her as if it were a symbol of her return to life. It was a ritual of cleansing, restoring her soul and the strength she was ready to use to breathe life into her new path. The butler said that Ron Vita's swords were found at auction, and they needed to get them all as soon as possible. The Duke disappeared very suddenly, and the butler even thought that he was attacked, and everyone in the mansion was very worried during his absence. The Duke warned that it was necessary to buy all the swords that they could find at all possible auctions. This matter turned out to be quite urgent, since the Duke ordered it to be carried out with a special assignment. The young man stated that among the swords there was one made with magic, and it passed through the teleporter and arrived here. The butler asked whether the Duke should not have brought more jewels, since after all it was a fight with the great prince. The Duke told him that the same prince had beaten his daughter, and the butler was afraid that the prince had suffered a cruel punishment at the hands of the Duke. The butler told the whole truth, and he really didn't kill anyone, but simply scared the prince a little so that he would finally understand where his place was. He was glad that everyone remained safe and sound, because the Duke was capable of many things when he was very angry. The gentleman certainly acted very deliberately and decisively, as he usually does. But Noah did not understand what he should do, calm the young man down, or congratulate him on finding his daughter. The young man smiled and replied that of course he was expecting congratulations. Apparently he had finally found his own daughter. All the aristocrats were probably expecting the arrival of the Duke and his daughter, and the Duke also had to consider whether he planned to adopt Louis. This mischievous boy was Stella's son, and the young man understood that he also had a small connection with him. 15 years ago, while he was looking everywhere for his beloved Stella, something inexplicable happened. She ran away and soon married another young man, and even managed to give birth to a wonderful baby boy. Then the girl died, and the young man was left alone with her daughter and newborn son. By repeating this story, the Duke felt that he was responsible for the life of little Louis, and now it was entirely his responsibility. He decided to talk about it later, but now he asked the butler to find someone reliable to look after the children. The Duke also inquired about the bells that could be heard ringing outside his windows, which had been installed last year. He asked the butler to immediately inform that from tomorrow onwards, this ringing should never be heard again. The bell has been ordered to be removed immediately, and this order must be carried out immediately and urgently. He repeated once again that from tomorrow, all the bells should be removed from the clock towers so that no bells could be heard from any tower anymore. The butler promised to carry out the order immediately and asked if the Duke had told Elwana the whole truth. He was very interested in how the girl reacted to the fact that a stranger suddenly appeared and began to say that he was her real father. The Duke was sure that Elwana thought that he had abandoned her and Louis, and that it was only his fault that they had ended up in such cruel situations. 1 month before the wedding, everything was fine, and the Duke's sweet wife was happily preparing for the celebration. But on the wedding day, everything changed, and the young man was left at the altar completely alone, and his wife ran away, and the Duke became the one who was abandoned on the wedding day. The long-haired girl stood in a lavender field in the rays of the sunset, and mentally said goodbye to her loved one, but she had to leave him. She really hoped that her lover would not look for her, although she was sure that this is exactly what he would do. In the letter, the girl asked for forgiveness for such a selfish gesture, but the Duke's heart was torn to pieces that day. He remembered with great pain in his soul that in one day he lost his loved one, and it was not his fault at all. Stella would probably never be able to trust him again, and it all happened too quickly. The butler noted that the Duke became very upset as soon as the conversation turned to his former lover. Even the Emperor could not change this, but these were only his fears. The butler insisted that the young man was not going to start a conflict over Miss Stella, and he was sure that she would definitely not want this. It seems that Miss then turned to Ranvita for help, and he took very good care of Elwana, even after her mother died unexpectedly. The Duke asked whether he should now be grateful, since for him this young man was still another man. The butler did not go into details, since this concerned only the personal life of the Duke himself. They heard someone knock on the door, and turning towards the entrance, the young man allowed them to enter. No one expected to see little Louis here, and he looked with frightened eyes at the young men standing in front of him. The butler thought Louis was a very cute boy and asked if he had come and needed something. But the baby came only to thank the Duke for taking them with him, promising to eat very little and not cause any trouble. You also asked to leave him with his little sister, and he doesn't need anything else, just to be with her. The Duke stood silently and looked at the boy, understanding how much he had to endure at such a young age, because he even managed to be in captivity. The boy admitted that 1 meal a day would be enough, and he would eat very little. The Duke smiled and replied, "Does the little hero really plan to live on just 1 portion a day, since he wants the boy to eat well and grow up big and healthy?" Louis was not used to having anyone other than his sister take care of him, so at first he did not even believe the Duke's words. The young man was going to do everything possible to ensure that the little boy and his sister no longer needed food and clothing. Louis beamed with happiness and replied that he was just incredibly happy and would definitely grow up well. The Duke was glad to hear sincere words from the boy, who was incredibly grateful for his salvation. At the prince's estate, the butler eagerly awaited the arrival of his master, but he had been gone for a long time. Khazar had previously said that he would be there today, and the young man was worried that something had probably happened on the road. While the young man was thinking out loud about what was happening, he finally heard the voice of the gentleman behind him, who confidently declared that he was not yet dead. Prince Khazar stood at the threshold, and his appearance this time was truly long awaited for everyone. Although the young man had been waiting all this time, he still cried out in surprise and was delighted when he saw the master. Since the prince arrived too late, he had to tell the whole truth that he had drunk the red fire and was poisoned. Khazar said that on that day he first lost consciousness, but after taking the antidote he felt better. But one of the symptoms of poisoning with this poison is loss of vision. The butler could not believe how the young man drank that terrible poison and was able to return alive, and how such a thing could happen at all. He poured him a glass of medicine that would help him recover his physical strength faster and asked the gentleman to drink it immediately. Khazar knew that the butler would always come to his aid, and he immediately drank the medicine. The prince actually began to have problems with his vision, and objects in his eyes began to gradually become cloudy. However, the medicine worked quickly because the butler had developed his own fast-acting recipe for the terrible poison, which quickly brings a person back to normal. He excitedly asked the gentleman to tell him what had really happened, because even after their return they could not find him. The young man laughed and stated that probably no one could find them because they were simply impossible to find once they disappeared. Khazar asked the butler to tell him information about Ranvita because he probably had something valuable. The unique swords called Diamond Knight of Despair and Silence of the Black Sun, created by Ranvita, were presented at auction just a few days ago. The bids for these swords have skyrocketed and they are now incredibly expensive to buy. The other two balls were bought with the Spes family, and because of this, people are constantly asking about the following documents. The butler provided the principle of information 2 months ago, which is now. Ranvita was the only survivor of his family's bankruptcy 30 years ago, but there was no mention of him for a long time, and then he appeared after his coming of age and opened a forge in Adana. He forged good candles, but if you compare them with the price, the quality of the goods was quite good. It was also known that his wife died after the birth of their second child. She has a 15-year-old daughter and a small son, but after the death of his wife, he received recognition as if his talent suddenly became famous. After his sword was sold for 1,000 gold at one of the auctions, Ranvita became famous throughout the empire, and it was clear to everyone that the price of exclusive swords would only rise, and now it would probably rise 5-fold, if not more. Dvoretsky spoke about the latest news, and a couple of days ago the auction lots went up in price. And Khazar understood that now swords would cost very much, and he was the owner of one of the exclusive swords. The young man held a unique sword in his hands, and the butler immediately realized that this item was of special value and belonged to Ranvita. Khazar said that the sword was created by alchemy and has much greater value than all the others. The butler was surprised to hear about alchemy, and the young man told how this sword broke the heir's precious sword in two. The national treasure of the prince's precious sword was destroyed in an instant, and with that very sword, Khazar has now mastered an extraordinary weapon, and he is probably not the only one who knows its value. He told the butler how he personally met Liana, Ranvita's daughter, and she used alchemy without any understanding of what she was doing. The butler suggested that if the girl's material was iron, then her possibilities knew no bounds, and they could earn a lot of money with her. The prince swung his sword and with one deft movement cut the chandelier hanging from the ceiling in two. This sword was truly special, and it could easily destroy any object it touched. After all swords are made of ordinary iron, but here there is mysterious magic that makes them stronger. The prince's assistant was confident that as long as he channeled his power in the right direction, he would be the most powerful on the entire continent, and no matter what weapons or armor were strengthened, all of this would become incredibly expensive things. Fascinated by the idea of wealth, the young man suggested kidnapping Eluana Vita, but Khazar knew that this was impossible, since she was now under the watchful eye of Duke Spes. Khazar said that he had already met Eluana, and at that moment the Duke burst in and was incredibly excited, and the young man had never seen him like that before. And in response to the question of why Hertz Spes was interfering in the affairs of the Vita family, it was now necessary to find the prince's partner. The young man insisted that the reason the Duke was still single was because there were rumors about his runaway bride. Khazar asked to find out more about these rumors and to bring her portrait so that he could finally see what the Duke's wife looked like. He remembered well that Eluana had green eyes, and he really wanted to look at the portrait of the Duke's wife. Green eyes were a hallmark of the Catino royal dynasty, and was it possible that this girl had the blood of the Spes and Satino families? Now, for the prince, this was the most important secret that could change the fate of the entire continent. The assistant asked him to tell about what the young man remembered about Elwana Vida, and to tell in as much detail as possible. Suddenly, the young man said that this girl reminded him of a fish, and this answer was extremely unusual. He was talking about fish, and as soon as he remembered this girl, a smile appeared on the young man's face. The assistant was even afraid that he probably gave Khazar the wrong antidote because the young man was talking complete nonsense. He asked how he managed to drink the red fire since he was always extremely careful on campaigns. Khazar said that one of his comrades named Kal had brazenly betrayed him and was an accomplice to other people. No one could believe the betrayal. They had always been like brothers, and for the last 10 years Howl had always accompanied the prince on trips. After some thought, the prince asked to find Howl, and he definitely didn't want to leave it like that. But the news he learned the next second simply shocked him, and the assistant told him that Howl was dead. While they were searching for the prince, the boy's body was found in the forest, and his limbs were amputated, so he definitely could not have escaped. The assistant knew that his little sister had disappeared a month ago, and he could only guess at the real reason. Howl had not betrayed the prince for money, and now Khazar knew what had really happened. He wondered if the guards should stop searching for his sister, since it would probably be useless now. Khazar asked to find the girl and bring her to his home, and asked not to tell him about it. He also said that this time Prince Regis was in Aden, and the aide heard that he had suddenly gone on vacation. Khazar understood that Aden was not the best place for a vacation, and obviously he came there for a completely different reason. There are some strange things happening in this city, and the principal has noticed that the mana levels in many places are incredibly low. The assistant promised to look into it. There was a chance that Prince Regis was involved in this, but if not, then perhaps people from the Western Magic Tower were involved. The prince just said that he saw several wizards with a royal license opposite the portal, but they were not wearing robes and most likely they secretly used the teleport. The assistant took a stack of papers and began to leaf through them, probably to show the prince something important. Having laid out several photographs on the table, he asked if any of these people looked like those wizards. He looked closely at the faces of the young men and realized that each of them had definitely been present in front of the portal that day. The assistant said that one of the people in the photo is the owner of the Western Tower, but this is already the fourth group. The other three groups were the elite from the Western Tower. And this means that the elite of the Western Tower is not somewhere there, but precisely in this place, and in principle it is not a little that this is too suspicious. He asked to immediately contact the intelligence of the Western Tower to report what had happened and find out the details. The carriage slowly approached the portal, which was located at the main entrance to the Imperial Palace. Elwana and her brother leaned against the carriage window, as this was the first time they had seen a real portal. It was their first time in such a luxurious place, and Louis was jumping for joy to find himself there. The building of the mansion was so huge that it might seem like a small city separated from the empire. With admiring eyes, Elwana and her brother looked at the incredibly huge building and could not believe that each of them was seeing it in real life. The luxurious house was the estate of the Duke of Spes and really looked like a small town within the empire. The sun's rays played on its bright purple buds, creating a mysterious dance of light and shadow. The scent of lavender, fresh and sweet, enveloped her like the embrace of a loved one, returning her to those tender times when she was a child. Elwana remembered the warmth of her hands, the soft voice that told tales of distant lands, and the bright days filled with laughter and carelessness. The Duke said that lavender was the landmark of the place, and a huge field stretched to the horizon. Moreover, the lavender field is a famous site of the Spes family's territory and is its pride. The Duke and his guests were already awaited by the courtiers of the huge estate, who were ready to faithfully serve their master. Elwana walked holding her brother's hand, feeling a little constrained in such luxury. The Duke asked to prepare a room for herself with the scent of lavender and chrysanthemums, and also to call Baron Rise's wife. If the owner of the lavender room calls, he must definitely come, even if he has to crawl on his knees. The butler asked one of his assistants to take care of the lady and her little brother, and he promised to do his best. Elwana was still standing near the entrance, and the frightened baby was afraid to move at all. The butler, named Dave, greeted the young lady and little Louis warmly and welcomed the girl to the Duke of Spes's mansion. Entering the mansion, Elwana was immediately struck by its incredibly large size and luxury, and the butler slowly told her where the different rooms were located. Eluana wondered if this was a lavender room at all, but rather a vast lavender house. There were portraits of family members hanging on the wall of the corridor, and Eluana finally saw her beloved mother in the portrait. Eluana was the spitting image of her, Mrs. Stella, who had lived here before. The girl asked if they were sure that it was her mother because she had dark hair, but it turned out that she simply dyed it. The lady was surprised that the butler was also acquainted with the mother, since she had died many years ago. Dave said he had known her for about 2 years and was responsible for one of the rooms, so that it was always ready for the mistress's return. That is, the butler had been looking after the empty room for a long time, and now Eluana wondered if the Duke had really abandoned her and her mother then. The butler asked not to talk about Madame Stella with the other servants in the future, because if rumors spread, it would be bad for everyone. That's what the Duke said, clearly not wanting any unnecessary talk in the estate after Eluana's arrival. The lady said that she understood everything perfectly, and the butler politely offered to show the girl the bedroom. The heroine noticed the golden frames, and it looked so beautiful that she was even afraid to touch the gilded windows. The butler said that the windows in this room do not open, and this is done for safety reasons. Since this was not at all an ordinary gold and it was made by the Duke himself, the building required increased security. Everything here reminded the girl of her mother, and her heart was pounding so wildly at the thought of what had actually happened to her. The butler showed the door that leads to the Duke's room, and the room next to it is connected to it. Eluana learned that the 2 adjacent rooms were connected, and if the Duke and her mother were lovers, then this was not at all strange. And now, the heroine is completely confused, because it remained unclear when her mother fell in love with Ron Vida, who was not her father. The butler bowed and said that if the girl needed anything, she could definitely call him at any time and feel at home. She stood before him, spellbound. Looking at the familiar face captured on canvas, her mother looked just as she did in her memories, with a soft smile and a warm look, full of love and wisdom. Silence reigned around her, broken only by the quiet whisper of the wind outside the window. Her heart ached with nostalgia, and unable to resist, she quietly greeted her mother. At that moment, she felt that the connection between them would never be broken, even if her mother's body left this world. Eluana told how she saw a lavender salad on the way and immediately remembered her, and finally found herself in the room where she lived because her mother always missed this place. Eluana hoped that Stella was happy in Aden, even though she had to move there. She was amazed at how invisibly her mother continued to remain with her, as if her warmth and light were always nearby. At that moment, Louis's younger brother ran up to the lady and joyfully called out to his little sister, and it was clear from his expression that the boy was feeling well. He said that his room was as big as the one in the old house and asked if his sister liked the new room. The Duke was a very rich man, judging by the luxurious estate and the huge rooms inside. Looking around, the heroine thought that the furniture here was too big for Louis, and perhaps he should change to another room. The maid asked the lady to contact her with any questions, and it would not cause her any inconvenience. Therefore, Eluana immediately admitted that the furniture in the child's room was too big, and it was necessary to bring children's furniture, or at least chairs for children. The butler had just ordered a new set, so the maid promised that everything would definitely be changed soon. It was surprising, but the Duke had taken care in advance to ensure that the child would be comfortable living in the mansion. The little sister sat down next to her brother and asked if he could live alone in such a large room, because she had heard that aristocrats had to sleep alone from childhood. Louis asked in surprise if they were also aristocrats, and there were a lot of little shiny dots here. Eluana didn't understand what shiny dots Louis was talking about, but he claimed that they were flying even behind his sister's back. The worried lady touched the child's head and was afraid that he had a high temperature, but Louis was completely fine. But the boy still saw flying shiny dots around him, and now he didn't know how to tell his sister about it. Eluana began to worry about the boy's words and asked if his eyes hurt because he saw small shiny dots. Louis asked his sister to turn around and said that there were shiny little balls flying right behind her, but all his sister saw behind her was the light from the candles. She thought that her brother must be referring to candle flames since he had never seen anything like them in Aden before. Just at that moment, the door of the room opened and a maid entered with a fragrant, delicious dinner. The boy was incredibly hungry and was delighted as soon as he found out that he and his sister would now be eating delicious food together. Louis didn't even have time to cut the large steak into pieces, and with a huge feeling of hunger, he began to chew the delicious meat. Having stuffed his cheeks with food, the boy asked if he and his little sister would really be eating delicious food all the time from today on. The sister replied that this was quite possible, since the Duke was very worried about their food. Hearing this, Louis was delighted and declared that he was incredibly happy and that they had never eaten so deliciously before. Suddenly, Elwana wondered if Khazar had made it home safely, and she really wanted to know if he was okay. But now, knowing his status, she thought that she was obliged to call Khazar His Highness, because he turned out to be a real titled prince. Louis understood that his little sister was very worried about the prince, and all because they had gone through a difficult path together. And at their first meeting, Khazar's eyes looked as stupid as those of the fish lying on this table. But her thoughts could not leave this dark-haired young man with deep emerald eyes, who in a short time became a small part of her life. The prince finally returned to his mansion and immediately began to deal with important matters, of which an incredible amount had accumulated during this time. The young man couldn't even start working because all his thoughts were occupied by one unusual girl about whom he couldn't stop thinking at all. The prince, looking around his chambers, approached the ancient table, which kept many secrets and relics from the past, and took out an unusual box. Inside the box, on soft velvet, lay a magical object that resembled a ring, but with two small balls on the sides. The young man looked closely at the magical object and knew that now, finally, its time had come. He took a hair from his head and placed it on the ball of the magic item, waiting to see what would happen next. These balls suddenly began to shimmer with all the colors of the rainbow, as if they contained within themselves an entire universe of mysteries and possibilities. Khazar asked Lane to come here immediately and said these words in a loud voice. The ring had the power to grant its owner extraordinary abilities and open paths to inaccessible worlds. Lane suddenly heard the master's voice in his head and was very scared, because for him it definitely could not be true. Khazar smiled and showed the artifact that he ordered from the Karen, and it is this one that can receive a signal from anywhere in the Empire. Lane said that if he had come a little later, the young man would certainly not have had to go through such difficulties. He admitted that on the way to the master, he decided that he knew for sure what kind of person it was who wanted to seize the young man. He told of Princess Mahel, who ruled the kingdom of Veloth and was quite famous throughout the empire. Khazar was sure that he had never caused any particular hostility, so that the princess herself would kidnap him on purpose, and this sounds very strange. Lane said that since last year she has been sending the prince love letters every day, but he has not even read a single message. The young man insisted that the kingdom of Veloth was not in a position to send letters of marriage proposal, and that the girl was probably in a very difficult situation, so she simply decided to kidnap the young man. It also turned out that Her Majesty the Empress had bewitched him well, so he tried to escape. All this time, Khazar did not stop thinking about the sweet girl who had walked this difficult path with him as soon as he was kidnapped. And now for him, this kidnapping turned out to be a great joy, and he considered himself a rather lucky man, since he was fortunate enough to meet such a girl. Be that as it may, the prince's assistant promised to find out more about the princess and report everything to the master soon. The assistant also brought the prince the portrait he had requested, and when Khazar looked at it, he could not believe his eyes. He could clearly see Elwana's face, and the girl drawn in the portrait was an exact copy of her. This portrait was left by Duke Spes 15 years ago, and Lena wondered if she really did look like Elwana Vita. The lady in the portrait looked exactly like his 15-year-old friend Elwana, and now many things became clear to the prince. The artifact that was sent in response from the Spes family was a gift in return for help. The price was too high to be called simply gratitude for helping the family's children, and it was now obvious to the prince that Elwana was the biological daughter of Duke Spes. The lady depicted in the portrait is most likely her mother, as the girl and the Duke's wife are a perfect copy of each other. After dinner, Elwana met with the Duke to discuss the important issues that had accumulated during this time. She asked if the young man really wanted to tell a story about his mother and her past life. Elwana was shocked, but agreed to listen to the Duke, as she also wanted to know about her mother. Her father immediately asked how much she knew about the imperial family, and specifically about her mother. Elwana didn't understand why the young man didn't talk about her mother, and he suddenly changed the topic to the imperial family. The real emperor is considered the first principal, and the second has remained a secret since childhood. The third prince is studying abroad, and Elwana just recently met the fourth. Elwana knew the details of the entire royal family, and could tell the details of each of them. The young man said that what the girl knew was true, but besides the royal family of Spes, there was another royal family of Santio. Eloana knew that the Fortuna family had long since disappeared, but when it came to Santio, they spoke of the direct descendants of the emperor. According to the dragon's declaration, only those who pass the trials will be chosen from among Santio's descendants to become the emperor. The royal inheritance is in the Dragon Hall, and every time there was a competition of any royal fathers who passed the most difficult test. However, 300 years later, in many other families there appeared people who called themselves descendants of the Canton, among them the Chief Duke of Fortune, born of a princess, who secretly returned from the test, rebelled, and became emperor. In the process, all those who inherited Santio's blood were executed and the line ceased to exist, and then the Fortuna dynasty began. However, the Fortuna family was unable to get rid of all the Santio. Then something irreparable happened. A heavy rain fell on the day and the rivers overflowed their banks, and the legend of natural disasters turned out to be true. The problem was that all the kingdom's defenses and the dragon's power stopped from that moment on, and for 12 days the capital was left without power, water, and security. After the tragedy, only the young princess survived, and all her relatives died tragically. Originally, she was supposed to be executed, but the new emperor became worried that there was a possibility that the dragon's protection would disappear when the princess was executed. Therefore, the young princess was imprisoned in the imperial castle until she came of age, and they only waited for that day. Eloana asked what adulthood had to do with it, and the duke spoke about the inheritance to the throne of the empire. When a member of the royal family turns 18, he must pass the dragon's test, and if he passes it successfully, a mark appears on his body the next day. Thus, the young man made it impossible for the princess to pass the dragon's test by imprisoning her in a huge tower. The later children who inherited Santio's blood were successfully accepted, and were even given patronymic names to distinguish them from those who were cast out. This was repeated for about 700 years, and before the age of 18, the girl had to give birth to a child. Eloana didn't understand because it was the Santio who were determined not to have children, and there must have been royal pressure here. They gave birth to a child only to imprison it and lose another child, just to continue protecting the dragon race. After hearing this story, Eloana found it simply terrible because everything sounded too cruel. Her mother's real name was Stella Santio Fortuna, and she was of the Fortuna lineage. And now the heroine finally knew the whole truth about the past life of her mother, who would never have dared to harm her. She found herself locked in a dungeon, and apart from the concrete walls of the dungeon, she remembered absolutely nothing. And these two ladies were like two peas in a pod, standing next to each other but separated by the thick concrete walls of captivity. Hearing her mother's real name, Eloana finally realized that she, too, had been in the huge tower all this time. The Duke said that Stella was locked in the imperial castle until she was 18, and for the next 2 years she remained in the lavender room. Eloana was kept in prison for only 18 days, but even after that the sensations were terrible for a long time, and she could not believe that her mother had spent many years in prison. It sounded just awful, because she was sure that Stella had a completely different happy life, and she just gave it all up and ran away with another husband. But everything turned out to be completely different, and her mother was simply forced to flee in order to survive. Eloana still couldn't believe that an innocent girl had been locked up in a dungeon and spent her entire youth there. In the end, it was all the fault of the people who wanted the dragon's power to live on. They didn't want to lose the dragon's blessing, and probably one of them didn't want to lose his throne at all. The heroine understood that probably no one treated her mother well, but most of all she was afraid that the treatment of her was cruel. After the Santio family committed suicide and after the major earthquake, she was treated much better. The Western Magic Tower cooperated with the royal family, and soon it became a secret that only a few people knew. When a child was born in the Western Magic Tower, they announced that the child had the ability to sense dragon mana. That is why they imprisoned the little girl in the name of prayer for the prosperity of the empire. It was probably a good reason, and the Duke was confident that at that moment, everyone had done the right thing. A month before the wedding, Stella sent her husband a letter and simply disappeared without saying a word. The young man made countless attempts to find her, all to no avail, and the imperial family also tried to track her down through rumors, but in the end, no one found anything. Teruto took out the letter and gave it to Liana to read, so that the girl could also be convinced of the truth of his words. Stella ran away just before the wedding, as she no longer wanted to live in captivity in the castle, and decided to go on a long journey, asking her husband not to look for her anymore. After reading this letter, Elwana finally learned the whole truth, that her mother had never really abandoned her. She left on purpose to keep her daughter safe, as she feared that Elwana would be forced to grow up in captivity in the imperial palace. The Duke was also to blame for this, as he failed to make her trust him completely, and therefore, the lady never felt safe. It all seemed like a terrible dream, and she couldn't believe that everything she had just learned was reality. And now the girl had absolutely no idea what she should do, and the ground seemed to be slipping out from under her feet. Teruto admitted that Elwana had two choices, and he was willing to help the lady with her pronunciation. The first option was clear. It was necessary to announce that Elwana was the Duke's biological daughter, and that neither she nor Louis would under any circumstances be imprisoned in the imperial palace. All this was indeed possible, but some small difficulties might arise, which, in the Duke's opinion, would be immediately suppressed. Elwana was against any conflicts and considered this unacceptable because any conflict spills a lot of aggression. The Duke declared that the lady would become not a duchess, but a princess of the kingdom if she agreed to surrender him to her daughter. Elwana was worried that the emergence of the Spes royal family was due to the spilling of rivers of blood. The lady asked what other option she had, since the Duke had said that she had two choices. He suggested not to reveal the fact that Elwana was his real daughter until the very end. They, along with Louis, will be listed in the family registry as adopted children, and Ranvita's alchemical abilities mean that he is a randomly found descendant of the Spes family. The Duke warned that Liana would have to be on guard all the time, because if it became known that she was the real child of both the Duke and Santio, then the first option would be inevitable. Since the Duke still didn't know the girl well, he wanted her to tell him herself what was best to do so that she would be happy. She understood that her happiness played a big role here, and she was very glad that the young man allowed her to make a choice. Elwana replied that in that case the second option is chosen, and she is absolutely sure of her choice. The girl did not want any conflicts at all, and was ready to do anything to resolve the situation peacefully. She asked if the Duke acknowledged her as his daughter, Louis's position would certainly become very precarious. Elwana certainly didn't know how to become happier, but she was sure that she wouldn't be able to enjoy life if Louis was unhappy. Teruto promised to do as Elwana wanted, and everything would be done according to her wishes. The girl said that she saw a field of lavender through the window, and asked if they really dared to threaten her mother. Everyone knew that if Santio died, a huge disaster would happen, which everyone would know about. And if Santio disappeared, there was a chance that the dragon's blessing would also disappear forever, so those surrounding the kingdom usually sent assassins. In fact, there were some people from the previous generation who were assassinated, and all this was accompanied by natural disasters worthy of inclusion in a history book. Elwana asked if there was anyone else besides them, but the young man admitted that she was the last of the family. The Duke asked the lady not to worry, and promised that no one would be able to threaten her as long as he was in good health. He was going to go to the capital and make Ranwit the son of his uncle, who left the family so that the first prince would be punished for the destruction of the crown prince. The first prince had killed many people, but Elwana was sure that this was not his only fault. He had also broken a precious antique sword. Teruto had been thinking about a plan for a long time, and finally decided to ask her if she wanted to become his successor. The girl certainly didn't expect to hear that the Duke would make such a proposal so soon. He wanted to make her the heir of the Spes family so that the girl would have a worthy future. The Duke confidently stated that he would very much like Elwana to become his successor, and he was very eager to hear from her as soon as possible. She couldn't believe that the Duke actually said that, because it meant that she would become an honorable duchess in the future. The proposal sounded rather strange, since Elwana was a girl, and successors are usually sons. But there was no law that prohibited women from inheriting titles, and the Duke really wanted to know if Elwana was ready for such a responsible and serious step. Understanding the high level of responsibility, Elwana thought about her answer, and she was clearly not prepared for it. The Duke told her that she could do whatever she wanted and her life would be entirely in her own hands, but as the heir to Spes, she could choose a completely different path and gain independence from the Empire and crown herself. The Duke also offered to reveal his heritage to Santio and become the Empress, and Elwana did not expect that the Duchess could become a real Empress. The young man assured her that as the heiress of the Spes family, she could choose some of the paths. But the only thing Eloana knew how to do was swords, and she was very worried about whether someone like her could handle the duchy. But she also understood that if she refused, she and Louis would probably have to leave. The heroine was completely at a loss, and said that she would definitely think about it, and now she was completely unable to give a specific answer. The Duke understood that all this was too unexpected for the girl, and she should have enough time to think everything over. He promised not to force the girl to do anything she did not want to do, and if the lady wanted to enjoy a peaceful and happy life here, then that could also be done. Eloana's head was in complete disarray, and she promised to think about all the options the Hertz had suggested. Taruto asked Eloana to think about everything carefully, and in the meantime, promised to appoint a teacher for her and her brother Louis. The teacher would soon be making a schedule for each of them, but Eloana was sure that there was no need to study separately, since they had never had real lessons, so she would have to start from the basics with Louis. The Duke noted that Eloana seemed quite intelligent and almost trained, and it seemed that Stella taught her in such a way that she did not know that she was learning. The little sister's joy knew no bounds, because she could study with her brother, and she was very grateful to the Duke. The heroine discovered that she never had a real father, because Louis's father was completely different, and it seemed that the Duke was bending over backwards for them, but she could not understand why at all. The young man admitted that he was more than sure that Eloana and her brother meant everything to her, and her mother in turn meant everything to him. That is why he believes he must treat his beloved's children nobly. After a delicious dinner and a pleasant conversation with the Duke, Eloana could not fall asleep for a long time, lying on a cozy, soft bed. Just a few days ago, she was sleeping on the cold and wet floor of the dungeon, and the heroine was incredibly curious about what awaited her next. Now she was lying in a warm bed in a large, luxurious room, and around her were people who constantly took care of her. But Eloana did not feel completely protected, and the girl became a little scared every evening. After some reflection, the heroine finally fell asleep peacefully, and bad thoughts no longer bothered her. Having fallen into a pleasant sleep, Eloana could finally rest peacefully and gain strength. She dreamed of a little girl with long golden hair, and she cried loudly as if she had lost someone. This girl stood in front of the fireplace, on which was a portrait of her mother, surrounded by white chrysanthemums. The baby was very happy when her dad came into the room and asked why his little lady was crying so loudly. The girl told how her mother always sang her a lullaby in her sleep, but now she cannot sleep and constantly wakes up at night. The father wanted to do everything possible for his sweet daughter, and every night after her mother's death, he fell asleep next to her so that she would not wake up. As soon as he fell asleep, a loud cry was heard from the other room, which meant that little Louis had woken up. Eloana also looked after her little brother, but at night she was mostly sleepy and often did not hear Louis's cries. The father was also incredibly tired with two small children, and Eloana couldn't understand why her father didn't get up and comfort baby Louis. The next morning, the girl woke up completely exhausted, and her head was as heavy as a huge metal ladle. She understood that it was just a dream, but of all the things that could have been dreamed, she dreamed of the time when she was little. After the death of his wife Stella, his father was constantly out of sorts and experienced great grief over the loss. He kept insisting that Stella had died because of him, and said that it was his punishment, and that he should not have dared to do this. Perhaps that was why he showed no sign of affection, and the boy felt distant and cold from his father, who simply fed Louis and put him to bed, but never smiled at him or hugged him. Love for little Louis became the concern of his older sister, who gave him all the tenderness and affection. Fortunately, my father finally came to his senses after 6 months, and he felt incredibly sorry, and only then did he realize that he had been out of his mind all this time. One day, he hugged little Louis to himself, and with tears in his eyes confessed that all this time he had been the worst father and had shown no love to the boy. Little Eloana saw all this and asked her dad not to cry that day, knowing how worried he was. Little Louis cried along with everyone else, and even though he was still very small, he also felt everything perfectly. Finally, the family was reunited, and the father, who had been around for so long but seemed to be somewhere far away, turned his attention back to his little children. When Eloana woke up, she realized that she had dreamed of that very day when her father finally realized that he had been far from his family all this time. But she was worried that she had this particular dream, and it had been haunting the girl since the morning. This morning, baby Louis woke up in a cozy bed with glowing circles all around him. They flew right next to the boy's face, and he, looking at them in fascination, happily greeted his magical friends. The boy was sure that these glowing balls always helped him, and he really wanted to know who they were. At the Spess mansion, all the maids and the head butler were busy looking after the youngest guest. Everyone was incredibly caring for little Louis, and today he had the most delicious cookie of his life. He was fed sweets and delicious cakes and given a lot of attention and care. The maids even considered Louis the cutest child in the world, because when he smiled, his cheeks twitched so funny. Louis felt that everyone around him loved him and thought he was incredibly cute, and this was a huge relief to him. Being nice was Louis's only strength, and it was the same when his father died. At first, no one wanted to help them keep it a secret, even though his sister needed to sell the balls, so that no one would know that their father had died. Then little Louis tearfully asked the unfamiliar ladies not to force him to go to other relatives and to help him with his little sister. When Eloana asked the locals for help, Louis helped her in every way possible and cried right in front of unfamiliar ladies, assuring that he wanted to live only with his sister. When the townspeople saw the baby, they were touched and always agreed to help them because Louis was incredibly cute. They never had any other relatives with their sister, and they lived together all their lives, always helping and caring for each other. Little Louis was convinced that his cute face was all he had, and he was going to use it to protect his sister. He understood that Eloana had a lot of worries right now, and she often felt tired. But as soon as she saw her beloved little brother, she always smiled happily and looked forward to meeting him. Today, Louis told his little sister how he went to see a beautiful garden where there was a huge white statue. He approached his little sister, and she admitted that she wanted to tell him something important, and the boy should listen to her carefully. Since it was long and complicated but very important, Eloana warned Louis to listen to her very carefully. Eloana told her brother the whole truth, but she wasn't sure that he understood everything she told him, and he was probably very worried. Louis understood why his little sister seemed so agitated lately and admitted that he understood every word she said. My sister asked me not to tell anyone about my mother because Stella is a fairly common name, but talking about her is still too dangerous, and it will be their little secret. Louis had always been a smart boy, perhaps even smarter than Eloana had given him credit for, and he already understood too much for a 5-year-old. But their life turned out in such a way that the boy had to grow up too early, and even at such a young age he was able to reason logically. When he first saw his mother's portrait, he was very happy, and remembered that in the picture at home, she had brown hair. The little sister smiled. Louis was indeed right, and their mother once had dark hair, but later she dyed her hair a lighter color. Louis found out that his mother also had blonde hair and admitted that she was very beautiful and looked like her little sister Eloana. Finally, the lady told the baby that they were of royal blood and were the last of the Santio line. Louis realized that he would have to be careful from now on to avoid getting caught because this family was too important for him and his sister. Therefore, he also asked Eloana to be careful in the future because she had said earlier that if they did not die a natural death, a natural disaster would occur. The lady actually said such words, but only now noticed that Louis had become so grown up in such a short time. She knew she should have taken better care of the boy when they were in the dungeon, and he must have been traumatized by those terrible events. Eloana was very worried about this, but the boy understood her fears and asked her not to feel sorry for him because it was not her fault what happened to them. And he just wants them to always be close and love each other, and for him this is the greatest happiness. Eloana hugged her beloved little brother, and he pressed himself against her with the greatest love he could express. The heroine realized that it seemed she had been more worried than the baby himself, and now he was protecting her like an adult older brother. He promised that he would always protect his beloved sister and become the most reliable brother for her. A maid approached the liana with a blue velvet box and said that Mr. J had asked her to give this to the girl. When the lady opened the box, she was very surprised because inside it were ordinary steel balls. The maid asked where my lady would prefer to eat today, and Eloana did not want to leave her room at all that morning. She asked the maid to bring food to her room because she was going to have breakfast with her little brother. The maid had looked quite polite all this time, but as soon as she walked out the door, the girl's expression instantly changed. She had warned the second maid that the mistress was going to have breakfast in her room again, so she was out of luck this morning. Because the ladies were very afraid of getting caught, as food had been stolen from the kitchen that morning, and one of the girls was very worried. Having gone into the kitchen, the maid wanted to choose another dish to please herself with delicious food. She brazenly chose from the dishes that were intended for the ducal family. The girl's name was Cindy, and she had recently become the maid in charge of the guest in the lavender room. She was happy that she would finally be serving a highborn lady, but her joy did not last long. It was even once the best lavender oil in existence for Eloana, and other families wait years to get their hands on it. All this time, Cindy treated Eloana like a respectable lady and tried to be friendly and caring. But once she found out that the lady was a country bumpkin with only an annoying younger brother in her family, then I realized that Eloana was here only because she looked like the woman in the portrait, but she probably had no idea who she was. Cindy wasn't particularly fond of her younger brother Louis and was very wary of him at first. The maid was incredibly irritated that the child was constantly looking at her, so she tried not to even talk to him. This morning, the maids had a delicious breakfast and looked at every piece with pleasure. The food was so delicious, and the maids couldn't stop cheering, praising Cindy and her wonderful idea. She asked none of the ladies to worry, because no one would even know if they put something else in the stew. Cindy turned out to be the biggest villain, and she never missed a chance to cause mischief, and could even put dropped food back on the plate. Above the majestic palace stretched a cloudless blue sky, which seemed to be cast from pure lapis lazuli. The lady with long hair was unhappy that her assistant returned empty-handed after the mission. This warlike girl was the head of the knightly squad, and she was very strict with all the knights. Another lady assured that someone had not shown up at the appointed place, but she would definitely find out what had happened. The lady understood that it was dangerous to continue pursuing this man because he was still the legitimate principal of the empire. Therefore, she decided to figure everything out herself, since she could not let her mother down, and in memory of her, she had to solve one issue. Her partner understood that her help was no longer needed, and the head of the knightly squad would figure everything out perfectly well on her own. The brave girl's mother was the queen of Ballora, and she had one unusual hobby. In the basement of the castle, there were 8 rooms known as collection rooms, and as soon as the girl was old enough to walk, her mother took her down and showed her her collection. What she saw scared the little girl incredibly, and in every room there was a dead person. One day the king found out about the mother's collection and locked her up forever in a dungeon, leaving the girl completely alone. The girl never understood why her mother treated other people with such malice and cruelly mocked them. The little girl insisted that she wanted to be like her father, who only looked at her, and she didn't want to hurt people at all. Mother assured that the girl must have her own collection, and when she grows up, she will become special. The lady hoped that the little girl could not disappoint her mother in any way because she would always be her beloved little princess. This girl grew up to become the head of a knightly squad and first saw the prince during a state visit to the empire. From the moment she first saw Prince Khazar, she could not go a day without thinking about him. It was an unfamiliar feeling for the girl, like butterflies in her stomach, which her mother always told her about. And this was a clear sign that this young man was the one who was worrying and disturbing her heart. Since then, the lady tried to find the prince and finally got on his trail, because recently the slave trader promised to give her the prince alive. Her assistant informed her that there was no further contact with Jay, and he must have disappeared as soon as things went wrong. The lady did not understand. She must have made a mistake and entrusted an important matter to a stranger, but unfortunately now nothing could be changed. She had just received a letter from the first prince, and the girl began to read it with sad eyes. But as soon as she read the first lines, she immediately realized that the prince was on her side, and everything was going according to plan again. She was glad that she received an invitation from within the empire itself, and the prince himself personally invited the girl to visit. Today little Louis was busy with an exciting activity, carefully examining a toy model of a huge ship. This ship was similar to the one his dad had made especially for him, and it made the boy think of his beloved father. Louis missed his dad incredibly, because many years had passed since he died tragically in an accident. The boy sat quietly on a chair and thought, but suddenly someone grabbed his hand forcefully and shouted that he should not dare touch the model of the ship. In front of little Louis stood that same maid Cindy, and her gaze was not very friendly. The boy screamed that Cindy had grabbed his hand too painfully, and little Louis was not at all pleased. The maid quickly removed her hand and said that Louis probably didn't know how expensive this model ship was, but the boy insisted that he hadn't even touched it. Cindy claimed that Louis was going to touch him, and she saw it with her own eyes. Suddenly, the maid began to speak loudly and shout and asked the boy to behave decently and not dare to contradict her anymore, and didn't he know that if he behaved badly, he would cause trouble for her ladyship. As soon as Louis heard that his little sister could suffer because of his actions, the boy immediately became very scared. Cindy laughed and said that Louis's very existence was causing his sister an incredible amount of trouble, so he should keep quiet. Louis had never heard anyone speak to him so rudely, much less say that he was interfering with his sister's life. Cindy knew her business and deliberately said offensive words to the boy so that he would sit quietly in his room. She was glad that Louis was now sad, and for some reason she wanted the boy to have a bad life here. But Cindy didn't know that baby Louis already had reliable protection, and these were those same little glowing balls. They circled around the boy, and he mentally told them that he was okay, and the maid hadn't said anything bad. There was a magical light shining on the child's shoulder, and he could feel that Louis was feeling unwell after talking to the maid. As soon as Cindy was about to leave the room, the glowing balls immediately flew after her. They crowded around her leg, and the next moment the girl twisted her leg and almost fell right in front of the door of the room. She thought she had managed to stay on her feet, but with her elbow she accidentally pushed the very same expensive model of the ship that was standing on the table. The model fell to the floor with a crash and broke, and its thinnest parts flew in different directions. Seeing this, the maid fell to her knees and did not know what to do with the expensive antique item. The maid standing nearby saw what had happened and how Cindy had just smashed the model of the ship. She blamed little Louis for everything, and at that moment, the boy looked at the evil maid with innocent eyes. He smiled and whispered, "It looks like Cindy is in big trouble now, and justice has finally been served." Sitting on her knees next to the broken model, Cindy cried loudly and screamed that this absolutely could not have happened. She knew she could actually get fired for this, and she blamed everything on little Louis, who was in a completely different part of the room at that moment. The maid tried to deceive the child, but the boy knew that Cindy was a very bad person. The magic glowing balls told the little boy that she was behaving badly, and the boy promised them to be careful with her in the future so that she would not dare to deceive him again and make him look guilty. In the prince's palace, an assistant hurried to report to him that he had managed to track the movements of the dead knight. It turned out that a man named Jay knew about the Ballura castle and introduced himself as a merchant. Khazar was surprised that the Marquis really supported the Dark Knight. He was clearly on the side of the Empress, and his spy network was exactly the same. As expected, the kidnapping was planned by the Empress, but the real target was Princess Mohel. They planned to eliminate her in retaliation for the prince being kidnapped. The prince was sure that the Empress must have been born in Ballur, but for some reason it turned out to be in a completely different city. The Empress's father was a nobleman from the kingdom, and her mother was the eldest daughter of the family, but she was later adopted by the former Marquis Fegamul. But that's not all, and the princess's biological father was not just a nobleman, but also a real chancellor. At some point, the Empress married the king of Ballura, and this was not common knowledge. The Fegamul family worked hard to keep everything a secret, but things only got more interesting from there. Although the former Marquis did not have a biological daughter, he originally wanted to have an empress in his family, so he made a deal with the king of Ballura, but the engagement was immediately broken off. The prince's assistant was unsure, but from that moment on, everything became even more suspicious, and the royal marriage was not so easy to dissolve. This happened after she became empress, and the king closed the border and killed the chancellor's entire family. He had killed everyone, down to the last cleaning lady, and the official reason was embezzlement. But now there were huge doubts about everyone. The empress was left completely alone, and now that the borders were closed, she was deprived of access to her own homeland. Since the Marquis was a high nobleman, it may have turned out that the family did not need the emperor's help. Despite this, relations between the emperor and empress have since deteriorated sharply, and they have almost ceased communicating. Khazar was surprised how they were able to hide all this for a long time, and no one even guessed. The king and the former Marquis of Fegamul worked together to cover up all traces of the incident, so after everything that happened, not a single rumor remained. So now the empress is trying to take revenge on the king for sure, and Khazar thought about it only now. The assistant asked what the prince was going to do now after receiving such information, since everything probably turned out to be different from what he thought. The prince inquired whether there was any news from the informant in the Western Magic Tower, and indeed, the assistant admitted that some information had been received. The Tower Master and a few select third-level wizards spent about a month in a secret location. The wizards sent there were the best at casting magic circles, and they were dissatisfied before leaving. But when they returned, they said that everything they did was for research purposes, and they probably said this under an oath. Even the informant didn't know where they went, but Khazar was sure he saw them use the fourth goal of teleportation. Regis had also been in Aden for almost a month, and Khazar knew the reason he had so little mana had something to do with the Western Magic Tower. The young man asked for a carriage to be prepared for him, but he had no intention of going to the imperial castle. The prince confidently stated that he urgently needed to return to Aden, and that he had some business left there. The silence and tranquility around the palace were interrupted only by the light whisper of the wind, which gently touched the leaves of the trees. The sun's rays reflected from the stained glass windows, creating a play of colors on the marble slabs in the garden. Waking up around noon, Eluana took a leisurely hot bath and enjoyed every peaceful minute. Becoming the Duke's heir was probably the best option for her, and this life was quite unusual for the girl. Enjoying a peaceful and happy life in a huge palace would be nice, but it is only possible if the Duke is alive. At that moment, while the young man is the owner of this mansion, Eluana can live here, but suddenly a tragedy will happen, and he will be gone, just as her parents unexpectedly disappeared. Therefore, the lady was more inclined to the option that it was better to become stronger on her own than to rely on someone. And she didn't understand whether it was really possible to become the Duke's heir just because she wanted to live peacefully and happily. The Duchy of Spes had the largest territory in the empire and was responsible for all the local inhabitants who lived there. One of the local residents, Lady Reese, wanted to meet with Eluana today, and the maid informed the lady about it. When they first arrived with the Duke, he asked that the children be shown to their room and that Lady Reese be sent to him immediately. That's why Eluana remembered that the Duke had mentioned her last name, and that's why this girl could be let in. Lady Reese wished to meet Eluana, and she turned out to be a noble, calm lady. Seeing the guest, Eluana bowed and said that she was very pleased to meet a local resident. The lady was so happy that she couldn't even breathe from excitement. She came closer to the lady and gently asked if she could hug the young girl she had wanted to see for so long. Eluana did not immediately understand why the lady, unknown to her, treated her with great care at their first meeting. The lady cried and said that she didn't even know about the existence of Stella's daughter and only found out recently. Eluana was surprised and really wanted to know why the noble lady was so incredibly happy to see her. The lady apologized and introduced herself. Her name was Rose Reese, and she had served Eluana's mother since she was a child. It now turned out that this noble lady was Mother Eluana's nanny, and this meeting truly meant a lot to her. Rose was at a loss for words as to how much she had not expected to see such a beautiful young lady who looked so incredibly like Stella. Suddenly, she looked at the table, and Eluana wondered if there was something wrong with the dishes. Rose walked further and touched the water that was meant for washing her hands, and it was completely cold. Eluana didn't understand what was going on, but the lady continued to examine the girl's room in which she lived. And she was clearly unhappy about something, because her face expressed complete anger and disappointment. She rang the bell and called one of the maids to figure out how this could have happened. A few minutes later, Cindy, who had just been busy with breakfast that morning, came to them. Rose had asked for another maid named Joey to be sent immediately, and it seemed like something was clearly going on, but Eluana had no idea why the lady had called for a second maid. She asked excitedly if something was wrong, because the situation had become very tense. Lady Rose couldn't believe that Eluana had been treated like that, and she was sure that Joey needed to see it for himself so that she could tell him about it. But the conversation was interrupted by the butler, who must also certainly be watching over the breakfast that was served to Liana. Madame Rose stated in a serious tone that, judging by her ladyship's dish, the Spes family was on the verge of losing their fortune. They looked at the girl's breakfast, but Eluana still didn't understand what was going on here. The butler, as soon as he saw the breakfast, bowed and offered the lady his deepest apologies. Eluana assured that there was enough food for breakfast. She was not at all against washing herself with cold water, and there was absolutely nothing wrong with that. The maid Cindy understood perfectly well that all the blame and responsibility lay entirely on her, but the butler was surprised that the lady was ready to wash herself with cold water. Eluana was still wondering if she had said something she shouldn't have. Rose admitted that this was unacceptable, and she must also check his lordship's room, that is, Louis's little brother. They went straight into the next room, for Lady Rose had to make sure that the lady was properly received. Entering the boy's room, they saw a completely unexpected situation, and there was a real mess on the floor. Louis heard people enter his room, and the whole time the boy was sleeping peacefully, but he immediately woke up and thought that his little sister had come to see him. Rose was incredibly happy to see the little gentleman, and with a happy smile she greeted Louis. The sleepy boy did not immediately understand who had entered his room and tried to make out the people who had entered. But as soon as he saw that his little sister had not come alone, he became very happy and wished everyone good morning. Rose approached Louis and was pleased to meet him, admitting that the little lord was a very handsome boy. Louis was surprised, because it was the first time someone had called him handsome, and the lady was sure that this boy was the most handsome of all she had ever met. Louis looked at the unfamiliar lady with interest, but believed her every word and felt that she was very good. Hearing the pleasant words, Louis was very pleased and was happy that his existence was not at all burdensome. But he really surprised the adults with such a serious phrase, because no one expected to hear this from a little boy. Eluana wondered who told the baby that his existence could be burdensome, and she was sure that her brother could not have come up with such words himself, and he immediately admitted that the maid Cindy told him about it. The maid just happened to be in that room standing near the door when she heard the boy tell the whole truth about her. She stood there holding her breath, unable to move from fear and anxiety, feeling guilty and probably expecting a very serious conversation with Madame Rose. There was a tense atmosphere in one of the palaces of the empire, and in Regis's room there was a loud crash of breaking dishes. In front of him stood Lere, who had just broken a vase and was shouting loudly that her son could not do anything right because she had sent him to Aden for a reason. Regis was very upset and did not understand. He did everything he could, but it still was not enough. Aden was now overrun with Duke Spess's knights, meaning that the prince was likely to be defeated. The young man claimed that even if the Duke stumbled upon that place, he would simply think that it was some kind of ruins. But the worried lady insisted that the young man didn't understand how serious this situation was, and he still thought that he could get away with it. She assured that if the Duke found the ruins while searching for Ron Vitt, it would be the end of the imperial family's fortune. But the most important thing is that Khazar managed to escape, and nothing was known from Princess Mahel. Regis believed that the lady had no reason to decline his invitation since they left no traces. The kingdom would never find Jay. The lady was sure that the fourth prince would not ignore what had happened, and everything would go wrong if he only returned to the empire. Regis was sure that this was impossible because he ran away with the child, but left the girl behind. He claimed that Eluana would never have vouched for Khazar, and that they had absolutely nothing in common. The lady knew that the prince could not be sure of anything, especially when it came to fate, love, or people. And these words were partly true, and Regis could not find out what Khazar's true reasons were for such behavior. The lady was Regis's mother, and she was very worried that her son was still so dependent. The maid presented her with a letter from the Marquise of Fegamul, and the lady began to read it with interest. The news was quite unexpected, and the letter stated that Ron Vida had been found dead the previous night by Spess's soldiers. But the letter also contained interesting information about suspicions that he had been killed with a sword. The lady immediately thought that her son, the prince, was involved in everything, but he insisted that he was not wealthy enough to do such a thing. And if it wasn't Regis or Marquis Fejamul, then it remains a mystery who killed Ron Vitt. After reading the letter to the end, the lady could not believe that it was really true. She asked if her son had personally punished the children of Ron Vida, but Regis insisted that only the eldest sister had received punishment. Now they learned that Duke Spess had recently decided to adopt Eluana along with her little brother. If the Duke is left without a wife, she will most likely become his heir, and they cannot allow her to hold a grudge against Regis. She didn't understand how this could happen at all, because she always told her son to be on good terms with the ducal family. Regis was sure that his mother had nothing to worry about and that he would become the crown prince very soon, but he probably just wasn't aware that the fifth prince's supporters were trying to cancel this ceremony. Did Regis really not understand what could happen if the Duke decided to support his brother and not his candidacy? The Emperor loves the fifth prince so much, but if the Duke supports Brother Regis, there will be no stopping him. The lady assured that Regis should definitely visit that girl and do everything possible to make her forgive him. The young man considered this a humiliation and asked if he would really have to apologize to some girl. Mother knew that he absolutely had to apologize, and now Regis had to restore everything that he had ruined, no matter what. She warned that the boy probably just didn't know what happened to Fortunas who didn't become emperors, and he didn't know how hard she worked to save their family. Regis had no way out, and he realized that he would still have to go and apologize to that girl. Mother asked not to call the lady an ordinary girl because now she is part of the family without her. At night, she must watch her words. At that moment, a maid ran in and informed them that Duke Spess and the Emperor had just had a private meeting, and as a result, the proclamation ceremony was postponed, and for the prince and his mother, this was the most terrible news. And at that moment, it became clear that Regis's candidacy was no longer being considered as the crown prince. The mother could not believe that her son had done so many things and was now deprived of the title that she had sought for so long. The young man realized that he was in a hopeless situation and promised to go to the liana tomorrow morning to ask for forgiveness. And he needed to meet the girl whom he had personally imprisoned along with her little brother. The next morning, after washing her face, Eluana thought that she really had no idea that washing her face with warm water was so important, since even the lords in Adana washed their faces with cold water. She looked around the room she lived in and realized that she was now living in the most luxurious conditions. Cindy and the other maids were fired immediately, and since they did not receive any letters of recommendation, they will have a hard time finding new jobs. The heroine didn't even know that Cindy didn't take her job very seriously, but now she knew the whole truth about the maid saying such terrible things to Louis. Eluana was disappointed and wanted to be treated as the heir to the Spes family, and she needed to become the person who was fit for that position. Eluana asked her brother if he minded if she left him for the whole day because she needed to take care of some important things. In reality, Eluana just wanted to go out into nature and get away from it all, and she couldn't stop thinking about the lavender field. The lavender, spread out for many kilometers, swayed in the light breath of the wind, emitting a sweet, rich aroma, full of warmth and tranquility. Against the backdrop of a soft blue sky, where light clouds lazily traveled, a carriage slowly drove through a picturesque field of lavender. Every turn in the road revealed new vistas of vibrant purple fields mingling with green hills and blue skies. Eluana looked out the window, fascinated, and seeing a flag in the window, she wondered if the coat of arms really depicted a real wolf. The coat of arms was adorned with a golden wolf, and legend has it that the very first head of the house had one, and indeed this wolf was depicted only in gold. The butler admitted that it was hard to say whether it was true or not. The wolf had died long ago, but they say that his fur had the most beautiful shine. Finally, they reached the nearest town, where from early morning, market traders had been selling vegetables and fruits. With the butler's permission, Eluana decided to look around and take a little walk around the city. She stepped out of the carriage onto the street feeling just fine and ready to do important things. She approached one of the stalls and noticed the price tags that were on the fruits. To Eluana's surprise, these fruits cost half as much as in Aden, and she didn't even believe it at first. Approaching the clothing stalls, Eluana was even more surprised because the items were also sold at a low price. As it turned out, it was much cheaper to live in the Duchy of Spes, and A turned out to be a rather expensive town. The butler said that everything costs more in Aden, and the heroine was surprised at the reasons why she should pay such large sums, since these things cost several times less. The Duchy of Spes seemed like a great place to live, and Eluana was even more convinced of that today. The butler was sure that this was the best region of the empire. The land was fertile, so the harvest was always excellent and enough for everyone. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said about the rest of the empire, especially in remote regions where life is much harder for local residents. The region also had low taxation, with one of the lowest rates in the empire. This meant that after paying imperial taxes, the family was left with a small percentage of income, and the heroine wondered if Spes had other sources. The duchy owned huge lavender fields that stretched for tens of kilometers. Tea companies and diamond mines also belonged to the duke, and in addition to this, he owned other enterprises. Half the tax rate was enough to finance the duchy, which surprised Eluana greatly. When the former duke gained independence, the imperial family compromised by lowering the rate, which remains in effect to this day. The heroine increasingly understood how many possessions the duke owned. While riding in a carriage through the fields, the heroine suddenly saw a pack of stray dogs running right next to them. She asked if it wasn't dangerous when there were some dogs running around, but the butler assured her that these dogs were clearly purebred and abandoned by someone. This meant that the dogs did not belong to anyone, but the heroine did not understand what they were doing there then, and whether they had really been thrown out by people from noble families. The butler sadly admitted that dogs were usually abandoned when their owners lost interest in them, and if Eluana wished, they could go out and look at the animals. In front of the carriage stood a huge number of abandoned animals of different breeds and ages, and they all really wanted to find their home again. Eluana got some food and went out to feed the dogs, who were probably hungry. Eluana watched the scene, her heart filling with warmth as she saw the dogs accept the treats with greed and gratitude. If the butler suddenly warned that if the lady wanted to take one of the animals, then she could do it right now, but Eluana was sure that it would be better for the puppies to stay with their mother, even if it meant being hungry. But the young man did not mean this at all, and he offered to take all these dogs if she wished. Eluana thought about it. It was a great offer, because the puppies and adult dogs were here without any food. She picked up the little puppy and asked if there was room for all the dogs on the Duke's estate. The butler promised that they would definitely send someone to pick up the animals, and having agreed on this, they soon left. The village they were now passing was located on the eastern border of the empire. Through the window, she saw that the local residents were in complete poverty, and the children were sitting on the grass in worn-out clothes. Eluana noticed them, and the butler said that these children were probably from another district. Because you don't have any starving children after retirement, they are immediately sent to an orphanage where they are taken care of, but those children that they just saw every day gather in the mountains to come here and ask for food. There were no orphanages in the other region, and such only existed in the Duchy of Spes, and the butler suggested visiting one of them. After all, this would probably help the lady make a decision, and Eluana was very surprised that the butler found out that she had been unable to make a decision for a long time. Eluana was terrified of the idea of having to lead a family, unsure of her suitability for the role, and worried that she didn't know how the world worked. The butler tried to reassure the lady that she could learn if she interacted more with the outside world, as she had done today. The Duchess was not obliged to do everything herself, and everyday issues were usually resolved by her assistants, who had the necessary competence. This news calmed Eluana down a little, and she didn't have to do everything herself, so the girl felt a great relief. She immediately asked if the Spes orphanage could take these children, but the butler was afraid that if Lilia did this, orphans from all over the empire would flock there. And so on, she offered to feed these children in exchange for simple tasks, such as simple garbage collection. Considering this idea excellent, the butler promised to discuss it with Noah and express his decision later. After a pleasant ride, Eluana finally returned to the mansion, and the maids, led by Cindy, were already standing at the entrance. They immediately noticed when Lady Eluana returned and greeted her ladyship. The heroine immediately realized that something was happening. It turned out that Prince Regis was here specifically to see her. The maid reported that he had arrived about an hour ago, and the lady was not at all prepared for the fact that a man who dared to lock her up in captivity would come to her house. She remembered very well how he had mocked her and punished her with lashes, but now he was right in her house. The maids warned him not to keep the prince waiting, and one of them suggested that Liana prepare for the meeting. But the lady was outraged by the unexpected visit without warning, and considered it very impolite to appear like that. The maids did not expect that the mistress would speak rudely about the prince, because everyone always treated him with special respect, and he could come whenever he wanted. Eluana didn't have any time left to discuss this matter, so she needed to change her clothes as soon as possible, and the maids took their job seriously and asked the mistress to help them choose an outfit. Eluana knew perfectly well who she was about to meet, so she didn't even plan to change into any festive clothes that had been specially prepared for a meeting with high-ranking officials. The heroine headed to the room where the prince was waiting for her, and the worried maids did not know what to do. Eluana had no intention of dressing up, and believed that she would rather die than choose clothes specifically for a meeting with the hated prince. She opened the box and took out several balls, deciding to take a few with her just in case. The maid continued to insist that for such an official meeting, it would be best for the lady to change clothes. Eluana only rudely replied that they should under no circumstances tell little Louis about the prince's visit. She walked confidently to the door and waited to meet the person she least wanted to see right now. The butler assured her that the lady was not obliged to do this, but she understood that she had to, because after all, he had come to her personally. The man only asked her not to forget who she was now, because the noblest blood in the entire empire flows through her. Eluana moved even closer to the door and prepared to open it, knowing full well who she was about to see. Opening the door slightly, she saw familiar red hair and a red jacket, which even from afar caused her horror and memories of a dungeon. It took a lot of effort for the girl to pull herself together and face her abuser. But her feet were rooted to the spot, and Eluana's whole body was shaking violently, feeling incredible fear. Although the heroine understood perfectly well that this man could no longer cause harm. Regis turned around and said with a sly smile that the lady had begun to live in luxury and would probably like to thank him for it. Eluana tried to be polite and not show that she was very scared, even just to stand next to Prince Regis. She whispered that it was a great honor for her to see the prince, and waving his hand, the young man asked the girl to sit down next to him. Eluana indignantly asked why she should obey the prince's orders, since he had come to her home. Regis stood up and expressed indignation that the girl apparently had not yet been taught etiquette, and probably did not know how to behave with the prince himself. The young man asked why such rudeness, and whether Lady Eluana was really offended because she had been punished in prison. She was outraged for a completely different reason and reminded the prince how he had killed innocent civilians. The young man declared that he was a prince, and the girl was behaving too arrogantly because compared to his status, she was nobody. And Regis was sure that he would do whatever he wanted if Eloana continued to be rude or indignant. He stated that he could even kill her personal maids if he wanted, because he was a prince and everything was allowed to him. Regis gleefully stated that he remembered Eloana's little brother very well, and probably thinking about him would make him behave well. Eloana tried to act confident and was indignant. Did the young man really come all this way just to stand there and threaten her in person? And then Regis remembered that in fact his mother had sent him to apologize, and he had not come for that at all. Eloana was afraid that the prince had come to kill her, and assumed that he was not very pleased with her behavior this time. The maids stood in fear and watched the conversation between the prince and Lady Eloana, which was becoming quite tense. The young man pointed his finger at the girl and said that he had recently heard that the girl had real magic, and he really wanted to know if it was true or not. Eloana stated that she sincerely hoped that the day would come when the principal would get what it deserved, putting her in a difficult position now. The prince found Eloana too annoying and was unhappy with the young lady trying to have the last word. But on the other hand, the prince understood that the future crown was at stake, and he had to do everything possible to turn the situation to his advantage. The young man smiled and admitted that he had been wrong all this time, and to make amends he promised to give her everything she wanted. In fact, the heroine wanted the villain to disappear from her sight forever and never return. She did not need jewels, land, estates, and she confidently stated that the Duke had provided her with everything she needed, and she did not need anything from the prince. Suddenly Regis couldn't contain his anger and grabbed the girl by the throat, and Eloana didn't expect him to allow himself to behave like that in her house. She asked the hated Regis to stop and absolutely did not want him to raise his hands on her. What irritated the prince most was that Eloana was actually a pretty girl, and he probably felt some sympathy for her, especially now that the lady was dressed in more beautiful clothes and looked like a noble aristocrat. The prince understood that Spes, with magic on his side, would be a pretty good acquisition. Regis smiled and said in a sweet voice that from now on, he allowed the lady to call him by his first name. The heroine felt disgusted by communicating with this young man, and she did not want to do it at all. The young man said that the lady probably just didn't know anything, but as soon as she became a member of the Spes family, he would be forced to send her a marriage proposal. In the future, she will become the wife of the crown prince, and will not be able to refuse his proposal at all. The heroine's world seemed to turn upside down, and she imagined a terrible future next to this man. The young man gestured to his neck and asked if the girl could see the golden seal on his skin, which was proof that he had the right to become emperor. Regis was sure that he would definitely become one, and that it would be the highest honor one could dream of. But Eloana rudely replied that if the young man had a seal, it did not mean that he would become the legitimate emperor in the future. The second principal was long dead, the third had fled, the fourth had disappeared, and the fifth was very small, so Regis was sure that he would become the emperor. The young man claimed that the principal was lost. He meant Prince Khazar, who had previously told the heroine that he was going to the Empire for treatment. Eloana was outraged that eliminating rivals and supporting the Spes family would do little to help the young man take the post of emperor. She admitted that she was forced to refuse the prince's offer, but Regis insisted that a better offer would not come once everyone knew about her past. The prince was probably talking about the fact that she grew up in a village, considering it some kind of shameful past. But the young man was talking about something else, because the lady was locked in a dungeon and he visited her every day, and there could obviously be different rumors about this. She warned that Eloana wouldn't even have time to debut, and there would already be a huge scandal among the aristocrats around her. The heroine felt completely uncomfortable talking to Regis, but she told him in a friendly voice that the young man didn't have to worry about her at all. But even if Regis had known that this would happen, he would have already behaved differently in the dungeon when the lady was locked up. With each passing minute, Eloana felt more and more uncomfortable standing next to this man, and she was surprised that she had expected him to behave well. The best option was to simply get rid of the hated prince, and the lady asked him to leave the ducal mansion immediately. But since no one dared to kick the prince out, he did not expect at all that an ordinary girl would dare to talk to him like that. He pointed his finger at Eloana's forehead and asked who she thought she was, but despite the young man's indecent behavior, the heroine stood with an impassive expression on her face. She was no longer afraid of this man, and she knew that all his actions and threats meant nothing. Even though Eluana was trembling with every cell of her body, she still had no intention of retreating. The butler could not stand it and intervened, warning that if the prince continued in the same spirit, the Spes family would take retaliatory measures. The prince was outraged that an ordinary butler dared to threaten him, but the man humbly replied that this time he was simply warning him. He continued to point his finger at Eluana, and the butler warned him again that if he were the prince, he would have stopped doing that long ago. But before Regis could say a word, His Highness Duke Spes entered the room and saw everything that was happening. The prince immediately removed his hand from the young girl's face and asked the duke if he had really been in the imperial castle. The duke heard that the prince had arrived at his mansion, so he returned as quickly as he could to greet the guest who had come uninvited. It was no coincidence that the duke had appeared at this very moment, and the prince understood that he would most likely now have a serious conversation with the head of the family. Spes reported that he saw the prince pestering his niece, and his eyes were certainly not deceiving him. Regis replied in a trembling voice that he was simply playing with the lady and had no intention of doing anything bad. To make the prince understand how wrong he was, the duke held out his finger and was about to poke him in the forehead, as he had just done to the girl. He came closer to Regis and touched his forehead with the tip of his finger so that he could feel himself in the place of the girl he was only pointing his finger at. And after that, the duke declared that now he too was simply playing with Regis, and he was probably not very pleased with such behavior. The prince was outraged that a simple duke dared to point a finger at him, and Regis's rage knew no bounds. Regis could hardly answer anything, but he was sure that as soon as he became emperor, he would destroy the ducal family. But since he couldn't do anything about it at the moment, he had no choice but to laugh and say that it was quite funny. The duke asked if the prince had come here for a reason, and that he probably wanted to say something. After all, the prince has no reason to come unannounced unless he has something very important to say. Perhaps the duke's presence was for the best, and in Regis's opinion, he should be more understanding than the girl. So the young man replied that he wanted to make amends with Lady Eluana. The prince said that he proposed to the girl, and there was no greater honor than to become the rightful empress. But it turned out that the duke no longer wanted to listen to the nonsense that the prince was now telling him. He menacingly stated, did the young man really consider it an atonement for her guilt to marry the one who beat her? The duke knew that he had dared to punish Eluana, and insisted that his very presence had a negative effect on the girl's condition. The young man smiled and replied, he probably just didn't take into account the lady's feelings, and he should just turn to her. The duke claimed that Regis had said earlier that he was just playing, and surely this also applied to the proposal. And did he really think that the ducal family was just a joke? The conversation was becoming tense, and an agitated Regis insisted that the duke had misunderstood everything. Taruto was outraged that the prince pointed his finger at Eluana's face, claiming that he was just playing. The young man claimed that the lady had been locked in the dungeon for some time, and he simply wanted to take responsibility for harming her. They had previously agreed to leave this incident in the past, and in the end, it could harm the prince. The duke insisted that the prince could be in big trouble since they had found the Ranavite dead in the forest the night before, and he had just completed the process of identifying his 2 children. The prince thought that the duke simply gave the girl his last name, and did not even think that everything was so serious. Eluana thought, surely she should have at least pretended to be shocked by the news of her father's death. To make the game look real, the lady started crying loudly in front of everyone because yesterday her father was supposedly found dead. Taruto apologized to the girl and admitted that he did not want her to find out about the death like this. He hugged the young lady and told her that she had nothing more to worry about because she and her brother were completely safe with their family. Taruto gave the prince a cold look, wishing him a safe journey and assuring him that he would now be forced to leave. The duke also warned that the prince should be extremely careful from now on because very interesting information had become known about him. After the conversation, the prince immediately left the ducal mansion, and he was again left with nothing. The duke watched the carriage leave and wondered how this young man had dared to appear in his absence. He even suggested that he should have simply killed him, but in that case the aristocrats would have been outraged. The butler agreed that it might be for the best, but it would make the situation too much worse. Regis was just lucky that Eluana took after her mother, and if she had been more warlike, the duke would have cut off the prince's head right in front of everyone. The butler assumed that the empress must have ordered him to do this, but he also doubted that the prince could have thought of it himself. Taruto ordered that all dealings with Marquis Fegimul be stopped, and that from today onwards all those under his command be prohibited from entering the duchy. The butler asked what about grain, since they would have no choice but to buy grain in other regions at a much higher price. Recently, the Duke asked his assistant to select personal security for the children so that they would not go anywhere alone. Alex Lotan from the First Nightly Company was a perfect fit for Mr. Lewis, and the butler considered him an excellent candidate. This young man was a very reliable person, and the Duke knew this very well, so he agreed to take him to guard Louis. As for Lady Eloana, there was one person in the first city who could go after her maid. This lady's name was Sunny, and she knew how to use additional weapons, which could also be useful for security. The Duke thought for a moment and asked if there were any other candidates, asked why Lee or Meal were not included. Since they were both nobles, the butler was afraid that they were too famous, but if the master was willing to settle for candidates from the Second Knightly Order, then there were two persons. The butler assured that Lady Sunny was the only way to protect Lady Eloana. Teruto had no doubts about her abilities, but something still bothered him. Since the master or one is in immediate danger from the first prince, the butler assured that someone of high level would come to protect them. The butler was right, and Sunny was just such a person, so they decided to revisit the issue if the children felt uncomfortable with the new guard. The butler also selected 2 more guards to accompany Eloana and Louis as they left the estate. The teacher was due to arrive tomorrow, and the butler reported that the man had an excellent reputation and recommendation. The Duke asked to ensure that the classes were not too difficult, as the health of the children would always be the main focus. Presents addressed to Monsieur Louis and the lady had recently arrived at the Duke's mansion, and the Duke was surprised that they had arrived so early. He was sure it was nothing special, but quite a few families had sent gifts. The Duke did not think long and ordered the butler to immediately return all the gifts back. And the only question that remained was what to do with their marriage proposals to the Liana. The Duke had not expected the marriage proposals to start pouring in so quickly, and it turns out the news about the lady spread incredibly quickly. It became clear to everyone that Eloana was now a talked-about person in the Empire, and especially that she knew how to use alchemy. The Duke ordered that all marriage proposals be burned and a list of families who dared to send them be given. While the young men were talking, someone knocked on the door of the Duke's office that evening. It was Lady Eloana, and she asked excitedly if the Duke had a moment to talk. He was just glad, and Eloana came at the right time, because he really was going to call her to discuss some issues. The first thing the Duke asked the girl was whether she liked living in the Duke's mansion, or whether there was probably something she was not happy with. Ever since they were accepted into the family with little Louis, the maids completely changed their attitude towards her, and everyone around became incredibly kind. This pleased the Duke, and he said that if she needed anything, she could definitely tell Noah or Joey about it. Preparations for Ronvita's funeral were in full swing, and the Duke spread the rumor that his knights had found him already dead. He asked if the lady would like the funeral to take place in Aden, but was not sure they would have enough time to prepare for it. Finally, the Duke confidently declared that the official adoption had been successful, and Lyta could take the surname Spess and could also choose her own middle name. The heroine was surprised how people usually come up with middle names for themselves, and some used their mother's first or last name. She wondered if she could use the name Vita as her middle name, and perhaps that could be done. She told the Duke about her idea, and he replied that the lady could do as she wished. Starting tomorrow, the heroine must begin classes with a teacher, and she also needs to meet her personal guard, and what happened today with the appearance of the prince will never happen again. If the first prince showed up here again, she could easily refuse the meeting without giving any reason. The lady realized that she needed strength if she was to protect herself and Louis, so she revealed that she wanted to take a position that even the first prince could not look down on. Eloana knew that she had a great responsibility, and that in many ways she simply lacked experience. The heroine responsibly promised to make every effort to learn as much as possible, and if the Duke did not change his mind, Eloana replied that she would like to become his heir in the future. The young man was ready to do everything so that Eloana would never regret her decision. Now she will have the opportunity to protect baby Louis and everything that is so important to her, and no longer be afraid of danger. The Duke promised that the lady would henceforth live in complete comfort, and that no one would ever dare raise a hand against her again. He promised that Eloana would have the opportunity to live the way she wanted, and gave his word that the girl would no longer need anything. Eloana thanked the Duke for his care and special attention to her little brother Louis. The Duke asked Eloana if she could call him father, since the documents would soon be officially processed. He apologized if the girl found this unpleasant, but he really wanted her to give him a chance. The heroine felt awkward because she had lived without parents all her life, and now she did not know how to behave. Her face turned very red, her palms were sweaty, and Eluana said that it was still too early, and perhaps in the future she would be able to call him father. Teruto was ready to wait as long as it took, because he really wanted to regain the trust and affection of his daughter. All this time, Eluana felt tense and said that she had to leave, because they had decided the most important issues. After she had left, the Duke asked the butler to send for a dressmaker and a jeweler, and inquired how the work on Louis's room was progressing. The baby furniture was still not ready, and it took longer than expected. The Duke walked over to the table on which lay a blank white sheet of paper with a black and white coat of arms on it. The butler asked if the Duke had any other important assignments, or if he probably had a further plan of action. Sitting down at the table, the Duke took a pen in his hands and announced that he was going to write a letter to the Emperor himself. In front of the majestic palace, with its tall columns and strict architectural lines, a wonderful sea of roses blossomed, and on a warm spring day, when the sun rose high above the horizon, the garden surrounding the building was filled with bright colors and delicate aromas. Cindy stood near the gate and couldn't believe that she was in the imperial castle after being fired from the ducal mansion. The head maid asked the girl not to look around and to follow her, because an important interview awaited her. Stopping near the door, the lady asked them to behave decently while sitting, because only the chosen ones can present themselves before the Empress and the Marquis's daughter. She insisted that someone like Cindy was unworthy of such a high honor, and she should understand this perfectly well. Cindy didn't understand why she was invited, but it was her last chance, since she didn't have a letter of recommendation. And she could not show herself in a bad light, and was simply obliged to show herself with dignity. The Empress specifically called this girl and asked if she really served Eluana Vida. Cindy admitted that she was indeed a servant in the ducal mansion, and the Empress asked her to raise her head higher and look at her. It was not for nothing that she called the maid who worked for the Duke and wanted to ask the girl a few questions. Cindy lowered her head and admitted that the Empress had the right to ask her anything, and she still could not believe that she was standing in front of such a respectable lady. The Empress stated that there were rumors that Eluana could use alchemy, and she wanted to know if it was true or not. The Bez family usually trained with beads once they knew what material they had an affinity for, and the Empress was trying to find out if Eluana carried anything like that with her. Cindy remembered that Mr. Joey had once asked the lady to hand over the steel balls, and she had immediately told the Empress about it. On the day the lady arrived at the estate, the butler handed her a box of marbles for the maid to hand over, and Eluana just sat there and looked at them the whole time. The Empress asked if the balls were moving, but the maid only heard Eluana muttering something. Rumors reached the Empress about how this girl could bend steel bars, but surely only because her life depended on it at that moment. She asked Cindy what she thought of the girl, and the maid had to give her opinion. The Empress asked them to speak freely and not to be afraid of anything, and Cindy, feeling confident, declared that Lady Eluana was too stupid. She was very eager for the Empress to like her answers, and said that at first she thought the lady was an important guest, but it turned out that she was just a country simpleton who did not even pay attention to expensive dresses. She said that she also never gave any housework, and all she did was look at her marbles, so she came across as a very stupid girl. The lady smiled and laughed, saying that it looked like they could handle such a simpleton themselves. But that was not all that Cindy was willing to tell, and she really wanted to confess something else to the Empress. The room Lady Eluana occupies was previously owned by the Duke's fiancé, and she heard that no one had lived there for a long time. There is a portrait of that bride hanging in the Duke's office, and Eluana is incredibly similar to her. They have the same eyes and hair, and the maid admitted that they are like two peas in a pod. The Empress had not known this information before, and now she understood that Eluana was certainly not the person she thought she was. She was not mistaken in calling Cindy to her, because the villainous was ready to do everything to harm Lady Eluana. Her Highness found out that Eluana looked like Princess Stella, but everyone was sure that the princess had never given birth to children, and even if she had, it would mean that Eluana's brother was from another man. The Empress realized that if she were the daughter of the worthwhile, she would be Santio, and if so, they would definitely not allow the rumor to spread so quickly, so she concluded that these girls were simply similar. That is why the Duke stubbornly defends her, and it all explains why a man who has no interest in the affairs of the Empire postpones the proclamation ceremony. Cindy had been standing outside the door all this time, eavesdropping, and the Empress was just about to use her connections to learn more about the ducal family. The girl sitting next to the Empress confidently stated that the lady would definitely be useful to them because she had more information about the Spes family, and in particular about Eloana, against whom the Empress was preparing to carry out an insidious plan. The teacher immediately noticed Louis's diligence and sincere interest in the learning process, so she often praised him for his diligence and originality of thinking. From an early age, he understood that manners and good posture were important in life, and so he worked hard to improve them. So Louis studied diligently every day and soon passed the posture assignment with an excellent grade. He had spent long hours rehearsing his mannerisms and speech, his shoulders squared, his chin raised, and his eyes confident. Louis also studied tea and table etiquette, learning how to hold a spoon and fork properly and how to have table manners, and he knew that this not only made him more attractive, but also affected how others perceived him. But Louis was not the only diligent student. His sister also studied diligently in the classes along with her brother. Eloana's progress was not all that remarkable, and she had to start over many times to successfully complete the task. The lady who taught the brother and sister supported the mistress and assured her that she would definitely succeed soon. After all the classes, Eloana was incredibly tired, and sitting down in a chair, she decided that she was hardly fit for all this. The lady asked Eloana not to be so strict with herself, because etiquette requires persistence and perseverance, and no one is born with it. Eloana watched her younger brother's progress, but it turned out that Louis was an exception and was already ready to move on to learning basic grammar. The lady had intended to continue studying etiquette with Eloana while Mr. Louis learned to read, but the girl admitted that she needed to learn grammar too. The teacher asked if the girl could read or write, but as it turned out, Eloana no longer had problems reading novels. The lady smiled and thought it was a great start, since the lady already had some basic knowledge. After several days of training, the butler came to the master and said that it seemed that Master Louis was a real genius. Madame Renée, who teaches Louis, said that she had never seen such a clever student as he was before, so she recommended that he be given a more experienced teacher. The Duke was initially confident that nothing else could be expected from Lady Stella's child. The butler promised to inform the lord as soon as he found suitable candidates, and they also had to prepare for a fake funeral for Ronvita, and to make the funeral look like the real thing, an artifact was used to dye the hair and change the eye color of the man who was found dead. The next day, Eloana had a private dress fitting, and the seamstress suggested trying on several different styles. The ladies were called in to select the styles that would best suit Liana, and would then prepare a dress specifically for her. Eloana insisted that she already had more than enough dresses, but they were sure that a lady could never have too many dresses and jewelry. Lady Eloana was presented with breathtaking pieces of jewelry. A necklace encrusted with sparkling diamonds sparkled in the rays of light. Silver earrings decorated with lapis lazuli seemed to carry her away to the endless expanses of the sea. The jeweler asked the lady if she liked any of the jewelry, because each of them tells its own unique story. Eloana asked the butler if she really needed to do all this, and if she could just buy Louis some new clothes since her wardrobe was already full to the brim. Butler option. Now that Eloana is officially a member of the family, she doesn't have to be so formal with him. The butler noticed that the lady wore the same pair of dresses, so he assumed that the children were not satisfied with the rest of the outfits in their room. She understood that if she was going to become the Duke's heir, she would have to get used to this way of life. She deliberately did not wear other dresses because they turned out to be too fashionable for her, and she preferred more modest outfits. Since the lady knew nothing about jewelry, she asked the butler to recommend something to her. It was too much for her, and Eloana admitted that she would appreciate it if Joey set a limit. But the butler said that there were no limits for the lady, and if she wanted, she could buy everything the store offered. Eloana looked at the butler with surprised eyes and did not expect that such luxury would be available to her, so she decided to discuss this issue with the Duke later. The exquisite earrings and necklaces, adorned with emeralds and rubies, looked as if they were made for a queen. Eloana, realizing that each of these jewels would truly become not only an adornment, but also a part of her history, was afraid to even touch the expensive things. After the morning meetings, Eloana felt awkward all day, and forging a sword turned out to be much easier for the girl than trying on dresses and choosing jewelry. She tried to calm down and remembered that there were metal balls in the bag on the table. The lady still did not understand how to handle them, and every day she looked at the balls and twisted them in different directions. She even tried to collect her thoughts, looking at one ball, because it was time for her to learn how to work with metal. Finally, Elwana got something right, and one of the balls trembled slightly as she mentally prepared to move it. Little Louis also noticed that one of the balls had moved, and Elwana was even a little happy. He said that in the carriage, the Duke once told him that chemistry was communication, and asked why his sister didn't just have a good time with the balloons, and surely they wanted to talk to her. The lady felt a little awkward talking to the object, but she had already tried everything and nothing worked. Louis didn't understand that it could be awkward to communicate with objects because he talked to them all the time. To make it easier for his little sister to communicate with the metal balls, he took a pen and began to draw something on it with interest. The boy drew a funny face on a metal ball and admitted that it now looks much cuter. Looking at the ball, Elwana smiled and replied that indeed, now it looked like a living creature and one could talk to it. Elwana greeted Mr. Balloon and told him her name, and after that it became much easier for her to communicate with the object. Another meeting was scheduled for the same day, and Sunny, who was supposed to become Elwana's personal guard, arrived to see Milady. Sunny was her nickname, which the lady got because she was so cheerful, and Elwana was glad to meet her. She found the name unique and smiled, admitting that she was very pleased to meet Sunny. Lady Sunny was 19 years old and was born in Karl. The largest diamond mine in the empire was located in this place, and the girl spent almost her entire childhood there until bandits captured the mine or killed her parents. While Sunny was enthusiastically telling the story of her life, Elwana yawned and realized that there was no time to catch her breath in this conversation. Now the heroine understood why the Duke had said that she might feel uncomfortable with Sunny constantly around, but this girl was the most worthy candidate for personal security. In a few days, Elwana had already learned to control the metal balls a little, and they even moved a little from their place. Elwana was sitting at the table preparing for training, and today she was very excited because she was not the only one sitting at the table. Opposite her sat the Duke, who suggested that they begin the lesson by spending some time with the metal balls and getting to know these objects better. For 5 hours, Elwana stared at the balls, and they spent a lot of time with the Duke just looking at them, and only after that he asked her to choose 3 balls that the heroine liked the most, but in no case to think about it too much, and just choose them, referring to her feelings. Without thinking twice, Elwana realized that it was the 3 special balls that suited her better than all the others. The Duke then suggested that they practice moving the balls, for which the lady would need to carry them with her and talk to them from time to time, and she remembered that Louis had said the same thing yesterday. Elwana still felt awkward talking to metal, inanimate objects, but this was the only way she could establish a connection with the magic balls. The Duke was sure that very soon the lady would understand that the balls were communicating with her, and it was similar to how you understand what a loved one is thinking just by looking at him. Elwana realized that she just needed to get closer to the balls and feel the magical power of the metal object. But she didn't understand how to do this, and in Aden the girl didn't make friends with anyone. Looking at the small metal balls, Elwana wondered out loud if they knew what friendship was. Suddenly the balls began to tremble, and at that moment the heroine realized that she had just established a connection with the metal object, and that was why they began to move. Elwana was glad that she had managed to do something, but she had no idea what to do next. But the Duke assured her that to achieve even such a movement, at least several years of practice were needed. After long and hard hours of study, Elwana already felt sleepy, but she was worried about the question of why alchemy was always associated with chemicals and beakers. The reason the family can use alchemy and are the only people who can do so is because they are connected to the power of the dragon. As is known, the first emperor Santio was very close to the dragon, and the first duke experienced many adventures with them. As a result, he was gifted with the ability of alchemy. The first version had a strong affinity with water, and this Pavlovali influenced people's ideas about alchemy. As a precaution, the family decided to allow this misunderstanding. Knowing what material the affinity is with gives the enemy the opportunity to find ways to block the ability, and there was no reason for the family to intentionally spread this information. The Duke asked Elwana not to worry, and she is the first child born from Santio and Spes, so her ability in alchemy should be unrivaled, or she understood she must live up to the Duke's expectations. She was incredibly grateful to the Duke, but she felt a huge burden on her shoulders, and she really hoped that the Duke would allow her to know the limits of what she could and could not do. But the young man assured that there were no boundaries here, and Elwana was free to do whatever she wanted. The lady was indignant, because recently Joey told her that the Duke would take care of everything, and she definitely needed restrictions on spending or restrictions on behavior with the imperial family. It was not the Duke's intention to propose harming the imperial family, but she has every right to manage her own forces if the worst happens. The Duke has been preparing for independence for a long time, and this is one of the reasons why the imperial family cannot do with them as they please. Besides, considering the amount of taxes that the Spes family paid to the imperial family, it would be awkward for them to sever ties with them, so the Duke was confident that Eluana should not leave herself a restriction. After all, that was what she was here for. All this time, Prince Khazar explored the territory in search of mana, but to his great regret, he noticed that the sources were missing, and this was not just a temporary phenomenon. There was probably someone behind this, and it couldn't be that the mana was completely absent everywhere, and the prince's assistant was sure that the Western Tower had something to do with it. The young man had been bothered by something for a long time, and he decided to look at the Vita family's house. When they went inside, they saw books scattered on the floor, lying right all over the house. Khazar picked up one of the books to see what was written there, because there was clearly a reason why the books were lying on the floor. One of the books told the story of the founding myth of the empire, but it did not have the church seal, meaning it was all hand-drawn. Khazar's attention was drawn to a painting hanging on the wall, which depicted Eluana with her little brother Louis and her beloved parents. Except for the hair color, Eluana looked very much like her mother, and the Duke still hadn't gotten rid of the painting, as people had silenced those who spoke of the Rona Vita and spread rumors that the children's mother was a natural brunette. The prince asked his assistant to remove the painting and take it with him. He wanted to keep everything a secret and help the Liana avoid spreading bad rumors forever. The assistant was surprised that the master was really going to hide the fact that she was a Santo, and probably didn't want to make a deal with the emperor. The prince smiled and replied that the brave girl had heroically saved his life, and he must certainly repay her with kindness. The assistant had never heard such words from the prince, and thought that the master had really gone mad. It happened 5 years ago when the prince's assistant signed a special contract on a dark and gloomy night. He tried to get into the building through the window, and this time he was lucky that there were no guards nearby. Suddenly the young man smelled a strong smell of blood, and his sense of smell was definitely not deceiving him. In front of him, he saw the corpses of guards who had been brutally killed by someone quite recently. The young man realized that this time someone had gotten ahead of him, and he could not allow himself to have to return to the Empress everything he had received. Suddenly, a dark-haired young man appeared in front of him, and he froze in anticipation of what would happen next. The stranger's clothes were covered in blood, and in his hands was a bloody, sharp sword. The prince's eyes, like two mysterious stars, glowed with a cold blue gleam, which gave his appearance a mystical aura. The deep blue light was lost in the vast expanses of the night, carrying with it a sense of alertness and magic, and the young man seemed to know that this light not only showed the way, but also attracted the attention of those who sought answers in the endless shadows. That day, the young man secretly met the fourth prince, who had mastered the aura at the age of 9 and had already managed to kill many people. The next day, the young man again entered the mansion unnoticed, as he wanted to see what was going on with his fourth prince. Every day, hired killers were sent to the boy, and the next day, the young man was once again convinced that he was definitely special. Even after 10 days, despite the fact that assassins were arriving at the mansion every day, the fourth prince dealt with each one. After some time, the young man really began to think that the fourth prince was immortal, because not one of the trained people sent to kill him could kill him. He reported everything to the honorable lady, and now she knew that the 3 empresses were trying to kill the fourth prince, sending mercenaries to him every day. There were so many killers that the young man who was watching all this lost count. He reported this information to the lady. She promised to pay and let him go after carrying out the order. Rumors soon spread that the 3 empresses had been expelled from the imperial palace for attempting to assassinate the fourth prince, leaving only 2 empresses out of the 5. As a bonus, the young man received artifacts of invisibility made by a 3rd-level mage, and the deal with the Empress was successful. The young man wondered if the fourth prince was still alive, but he saw with his own eyes how the boy bravely fought for his life every day. The young man decided to take advantage of the opportunity to test the magic of invisibility, and so he went again to the fourth prince. He sneaked into the mansion using invisibility magic and noticed a lady in the hallway excitedly looking for the priest. He already thought that someone had defeated the fourth prince, and that one of the assassins had probably gotten to him, since the maid was so excitedly looking for the priest. For some reason, everyone in the mansion was excited, and the maids and the butler stood near the fourth prince's room. For some reason, everyone was afraid to come closer to the young man and watched him from afar, sitting on the floor in the hall. The fourth prince's little sister lay unconscious in his arms, her face pale and her lips blue. The young man whispered that he asked the child not to eat anything here because he understood perfectly well that he could be poisoned. But the girl was now only glad for one thing, that at least her brother remained alive. He didn't believe what was happening, as if it was a nightmare from which he would not be able to wake up. There was silence all around, only the wind gently whispered among the trees, as if the world itself pitied him. The prince held the girl close to him, feeling her light breath on her skin, and his heart beat in unison with every breath she took. The girl smiled and replied that she really wanted to see the young man become emperor, and she was sure that Khazar would be the best emperor in the world. She really wanted him to realize his childhood dream and become a ruler, and Khazar tearfully promised the girl that he would definitely do this. A young man in invisibility magic was watching everything that was happening, and he did not expect at all to find himself involved in this situation. He found the very same cookies that were laced with deadly poison, and someone dared to deliberately feed them to his child. The prince's assistant asked him not to blame himself under any circumstances, and after everything that had happened, Khazar simply wanted to be left alone. But he didn't know that all this time the same young man in invisibility magic was standing next to him, watching the suffering of the young prince. The young man was sure that no one could see him, but suddenly the fourth prince asked a question, but there was no one in the room except the two of them. The young man realized that the boy was addressing him specifically, and he shuddered in surprise upon hearing the question. He turned around and said that he had spared him only because he was simply watching, and in any case the stranger had no chance against him. It became obvious that the fourth prince could see through the invisibility artifacts, and the young man now realized that he definitely would not be able to defeat the prince. But he knew that he could save his life if he told the truth, and he declared that he had really only been watching the prince and reporting to his client. Khazar guessed everything and did not feel that the stranger wanted to attack him, so he left him alive. The young man was surprised and asked how the prince knew that he was here, and since Khazar could use aura, he was definitely not a magician, and there must probably be a way to destroy him. The prince asked what he would receive if he told the truth, and confessed that he wanted to stay alive until he was 17. And the fact that he simply remains alive will in itself be revenge for all who are eager to destroy the fourth prince. The young man promised Khazar that he would definitely help with this, and they managed to agree on a deal. The boy asked if the stranger was even capable of protecting him, and as it turned out, the young man was the leader of the Edelweiss. The prince laughed, because the leader was also a child. Rumors reached the prince that the leader was an old man, and it was the boy's father who had died last year. He walked up to his desk and offered to sign a contract so that each party would be confident that the task would be completed. After reading the contract, the young man decided to give in to the young prince and sign it, because he probably doesn't suspect that the Western Magic Tower can terminate magic contracts. Khazar carefully looked over every line and signature, and the young man still wanted to know how the fourth prince managed to see him through the magic of invisibility. Khazar stated that he had the makings of a wizard, but with his aura, he would hardly be able to become one. The fourth prince could see mana, and it gathered around those who could become wizards, and he told the stranger about it. He couldn't believe that some boy was blessed with mana, and it was actually true. A child blessed with mana is born every 9 years and is destined to become a great wizard. However, most of them die tragically, being sold to Western magic towers where they die while being subjected to magical experiments. Upon hearing this information, the young man was very surprised that the prince personally told him about it, because if he was sold to the tower, the empress would find out about everything. Khazar stated that this was precisely what the contract was for, but the young man insisted that magical contracts could also be terminated. Khazar knew this very well, and asked if the young man knew the person who could terminate the contract concluded by the Chiron himself. Chiron was the most powerful wizard, and only a wizard who is 2 levels higher than the one who made the contract can break a magical contract. In other words, at the moment there is not a single wizard who is capable of breaking this contract. The young man, without knowing it, signed a magical contract, and now he had to serve the fourth prince and take care of him until he turned 17. Since that day, Khazar's assistant had done a lot, but the time had come, and now he realized that he had to put an end to it. He tried to convince the master that it was impossible, and he would not be able to hide for long that Elwana belonged to the Santio family. Besides, he knew how inhumanely this imperial family was continuing. Khazar was sure it would not be an exaggeration to say that the empire was built on Santio's tears, and they all owed a great debt to this family. That is why this tragedy must be put to an end, and Khazar knew that he had great power in his hands and he could help the girl. The prince really wanted the young man in the portrait to be on the throne instead of him, and he was sure that the man really deserved power. Now they had to destroy the evidence that Elwana also belonged to another family. The prince's assistant had no choice but to unquestioningly follow his master's orders, and now he had to destroy the family history by bringing a lighter to the painting. The painting depicting Elwana's family was burned, and the prince was sure that this was the best decision for the girl herself. There were loud cries in Prince Regis's mansion, and after meeting with Elwana, he had a conversation with his mother, who was unhappy that the young man had failed to fulfill an important request. Instead of apologizing to the lady, he quarreled with Duke Spes, and could easily have lost his favor. Regis insisted that the girl had the audacity to reject his offer to become crown princess. Mother did not understand why the young man even suggested that the lady become the crown princess, since they had not agreed on this at all. Since Elwana could use alchemy, Regis thought that an alliance with the Spes dukedom seemed advantageous, but Elwana refused him. Mother was disappointed that she sent her son alone, confidently declaring that Elwana would not be able to become crown princess. Because Regis is not the crown prince at all, and the proclamation ceremony has not been postponed but cancelled altogether. Just recently, Duke Spes wrote a 23-page letter to the venerable emperor in which he described in detail what had happened. After reading the long, threatening letter, His Majesty was forced to take medicine for his migraine and then cancelled the ceremony. Regis couldn't believe that the ceremony had actually been officially cancelled and blamed it all on Elwana, whom he had spent too much time on. The mother asked her son to pretend that he was repentant, and she promised to think of something. Before she could finish speaking, a long-haired sweet lady approached her, asking Her Majesty to spare a moment of her attention. The lady really wanted to help the lady and decided that she had the right to interfere in family affairs. The lady had no idea how the young lady could help with such serious issues and was surprised by her offer. She said that the lavender room in the Duke's estate was intended for her, the Lavender Lady. She considered herself a potential bride for Duke Spes, stating that she felt a little awkward when two adopted children appeared out of nowhere. The lady's name was Shabaya, and Regis laughed that the girl was so infatuated with the Duke that at this rate she would remain an old maid. She smiled and said that the young man really didn't understand anything and was talking complete nonsense. Shabia was sure that it might be Fejimul, but she would take her husband's surname when she got married. She stated what was the point of becoming the queen of another kingdom if in case of drought she would have to beg for food from the empire, and the third blessing of the dragon would only extend to the empire. The third blessing of the dragon was that the people would not drown in sorrow or despair, and the empire would not be threatened by drought or heavy rains. She knew that if Regis became emperor, she would have to beg him for food, and she didn't want to ask this fool for help. She stated that only the Duke and Marquis remained, but they were out of the question since they both supported the fifth prince. Therefore, Shabia was sure that Duke Spes was her only option if she did not want her position in society to fall. Regis assured her that Duke Spes showed no interest in Shabia and that she had no hope at all. This applied to all women, but Shabia considered herself special, and besides, it meant she wouldn't have to worry about the Duke having mistresses. Regis still couldn't understand what all the fuss was about, but Shabia wasn't going to explain any more. She stated that she knew a child who had recently come of age, and no one would suspect them if they came to an agreement with this girl. Regis's mother asked if she was sure she could handle it, since Duke Spes had a genius mind and intelligence. Rather than risk her life, Shabia planned to make her steps untraceable, and even if something went wrong, she was sure their names would never surface. She suggested that they consider making Elwana the crown princess, and in the end, if the Duke thwarted this plan, he would show how dear she was to him. Considering that the Duke had sent the registrar away unharmed even after what he had done, his mother was certain that this girl was definitely not his biological daughter. So making her an obedient crown princess was clearly not a bad idea, and the prince and his mother listened to it. The lady understood that Lady Shabaya was determined, and it was not without reason that she had thought out this plan in such detail. That is why she allowed the lady to do as she wished and promised to do everything in the best possible way. A long time had passed since Elwana's imprisonment in the dungeon, but every night she was still haunted by the ringing of the bell, after which the bloodthirsty Regis would come and beat her with a whip. She suddenly woke up hearing her brother's voice, and in her sleep she was incredibly scared that they were still in captivity. Louis woke up his little sister that night, asking her to lie down next to her because he had not been able to sleep for a long time. Eluana carefully laid her brother down next to her, stroked his head, and wished him good night. Covered with a soft blanket, Louis whispered that he could hear his sister's heart pounding. The lady smiled and sweetly replied that she had just had a bad dream and that her brother didn't have to worry about anything. He asked her to tell him, and Eluana tried to come up with a dream on the fly that wouldn't sound so scary to little Louis. She said that in her dream she was just running and got scared, and Louis, after listening to his little sister, promised that in the next dream he would run next to her so that she would not be scared anymore. Caring, Eluana hugged the baby and laughed, promising to never let him go and always be there. After Regis's visit, she had terrible nightmares every night, and the heroine was very afraid that she would end up in that hell again. She lay next to baby Louis and felt that she couldn't be so helpless. But she still could not forget the horror that she and Louis had experienced when they were prisoners in the prince's dungeon. Baby Louis was already fast asleep when Eluana suddenly heard the noise of metal balls near the bed. The Duke praised her for being able to move the ball, but Eluana wanted to become stronger and did not understand what was useful in her knowledge. The heroine wanted to become so strong that even Regis wouldn't dare touch her, and tomorrow they were finally supposed to head back to Aden. The next day, the young man arrived at the order of the prince's assistant and delivered a wooden box to his office. In it lay a special magic sword of the Silent Night, which the young man had long wanted to obtain. The young man said that tomorrow Lady Eluana and Mr. Louis would go to Aden to attend Ronvit's funeral. Hearing this information, Khazar realized that they needed to return back to Adan so that Eluana would be safe. Lady Eluana sat in the carriage, slowly rolling along the bumpy road, returning to her native Aden. A bright joy filled her, but at the same time she felt a slight uncertainty. Aden was waiting for her, and with it, all those memories that she kept in her heart. And Eluana did not even imagine that Prince Khazar himself was coming to the small town to watch over her safety. The carriage slowly approached the majestic teleportation portal, its arch towering before them, as if personifying a bridge between worlds. The portal glowed with a soft blue light, sparks dancing within its vortex, creating a mesmerizing sight, and Sunny looked out the window in awe. This was Sunny's first time using the teleportation gate, and the lady was overjoyed and was going to show off to the other knights when she returned. Louis listened with delight to the stories of the cheerful Sunny, and Eluana noticed that the boy seemed to enjoy her company, and perhaps she could get used to her too. Finally, they stopped at one of the streets of the town, and Louis asked his sister for permission to look at the street stalls. Eluana thought for a moment, then suggested that her brother go and look at them together. There was some delicious food on the main street, and Eluana and Louis took the chance to have a tasty meal. They walked slowly past the shops and stalls, and Louis noticed one interesting thing. He saw a model of a ship made by hand from wood and paper and admired how beautiful it was. He asked the seller if it was a 3-meter Ratna ship, and the merchant confirmed that it was that model. As soon as Louis saw this ship, he immediately wanted to take it with him, and in a sweet voice asked his sister for permission. He took it for a reason, because his friend Hans really wanted such a model of a ship, and little Louis always remembered this. Louis was incredibly happy holding the toy ship in his hands and was going to give his friend a great gift when they arrived in their hometown. Suddenly, loud conversations of people were heard nearby, and the locals immediately paid attention to it. Louis suggested going and seeing what was going on, and Eluana agreed to go with her brother. A huge crowd had already gathered around these people, and Eluana tried to see through the large number of people what had happened on the street. The bald man held the boy in his arms and shouted that he had caught the little thief who had stolen his goods. Next to them stood a lady and a man who begged that they were very sorry for their son's antics and that they were not guilty of anything. They just did not keep an eye on the boy. The man believed that a simple apology would not be enough and was probably hinting that he should be paid. He asked for 80 pieces of silver, 10 times more than what the boy had stolen. The boy's frightened father insisted that they didn't have that much money and asked them to come to some kind of agreement. Eluana and Louis watched closely what was happening and understood that these people probably needed their help. The man suggested that someone work for the money or the family would have to pay the full amount right away. At that moment, a girl's voice was heard nearby, asking her mother and father what was going on here. It was probably their daughter, who didn't know what had happened and only now approached her parents. The father looked at the girl and was glad that she came just in time. He grabbed his daughter by the hand and offered to give her to the man instead of money, since he was very afraid of this man and understood that he could punish their son. The young lady had absolutely no idea what was going on here and why her father was trying to give her to a stranger. She screamed and tried to find out, but he warned that they could not allow a man to punish her little brother. The boy cried and screamed that he didn't want to die at all, and the family eventually decided to give their daughter to this man. He agreed to these conditions and grabbed the girl's hand, who was seeing him for the first time in her life. She screamed and asked someone from the crowd to help her, realizing that her parents remained indifferent to this situation. And between her and her younger brother, they chose the safety of their younger brother, saying goodbye to their daughter forever. The man was sure that he had made a very profitable deal for himself by taking the girl from someone else's family. But suddenly, a metal ball flew at his head, and the man turned around in rage, shouting, "Who dared to do this?" From the crowd, the sweet Eluana emerged and raised her hand, confidently declaring that it was she who had thrown the metal ball. Seeing what was happening, she wanted to hit this man hard, but the ball seemed to fly out and do everything for her. The man saw that there was a guard standing behind the lady and realized that this girl was clearly of noble birth. He muttered excitedly that it had been a huge mistake and he just wanted his compensation. Eluana's guard informed the girl that there was no need to deal with this man, and Sunny was ready to rush into battle. She grabbed her whip and screamed that this man must definitely be punished and rushed to beat him with the whip. Everyone was sure that they could not just leave this situation like that, and the villain must certainly be punished. Sunny wasn't sure if she should help her lady finish this job, but the lady asked the girl not to kill anyone. The warlike lady wrapped a whip around the man's throat and screamed that she was giving him 3 seconds to disappear, leave the girl, and never show up there again. The villain insisted that he had done nothing wrong and that the boy himself was to blame for stealing his goods. He knew it would be best for him to run away and leave the girl, because Eluana was clearly the one who could punish him. When he finally disappeared from sight, the terrified girl thanked her mistress for saving her. Seeing the poor girl, she realized that she clearly did not have the best life, and her parents were able to get rid of her so easily. But the saddest thing is that this girl is not guilty of anything at all, and her life has become one of the bad people. Eluana had once suffered too, simply because she was surrounded by bad people, and the scars on her back still reminded her of those dark days. But now she was no longer a village simpleton, but Eluana Vita Spes, the daughter of a venerable duke. This sweet lady's name was Ring, and Eluana offered to go with her because she now had the power to change other people's lives for the better. Ring couldn't even believe her luck, because just recently she almost ended up in the clutches of a cruel villain. And now the noble lady is pulling her hand and offering to go with her. I assure you that everyone will certainly be glad to see her. Ring stood up from the cold concrete road and turned around to take one last look at the parents who had abandoned her to her fate. They stood with their little son, realizing that their daughter would never return to them. She approached the girl and confessed that she no longer had a home and asked the lady to take her with her, promising that she was ready to work hard and would try to make her life better. They soon arrived at the ducal mansion, and the new guest was given a guest room. There was even a bed in this room, which Ring had never had in her life, and as she buried her face in the pillow, she felt for the first time how pleasant it was. She had never lain in a clean bed, and she lay down on it with such joy that when she got up, she was very frightened. The snow-white bed quickly became covered with dirty stains from the girl's hands and face, and she was very afraid that these stains would not be erased. Little Louis knocked on the door, holding a new change of clothes, specially designed for the Ring. The girl looked at the clothes in surprise and at first did not even believe that she could really wear them. She immediately admitted that she had accidentally stained the bedspread and was very worried about it. Louis looked at the bed and confidently declared that the linen was clean and the girl had absolutely nothing to worry about. She turned around and looked closely at the bed, which was snow white, and could not believe her eyes, because she had just recently clearly seen dirty spots on the sheet. Louis asked the girl to come up to the second floor when she was ready, and Ring sighed, but the bed was indeed clean. Louis promised to introduce the lady to the guards at dinner, since, after all, she was now a member of the Spes ducal family. Ring didn't know how to thank her for such care, because not long ago she lived with cruel parents who easily agreed to sell her. Now she was ready to take care of Louis's sister for the rest of her days, and promised the boy that she would definitely do so. She was very happy that she ended up in a wonderful family where kind people accepted her. Lady Eluana and her little brother Louis stood at the threshold of their hometown of Aden, and excitement reigned in their hearts. She knew home wasn't just a place, it was the people who made it that way. And although the road had been long and hard, she was ready to begin a new chapter, full of possibility and hope. The sun's rays, breaking through the clouds, enveloped the city in a warm light, and around them they could hear the noise of life, the laughter of passers-by, and every sound reminded them of what a native place is, full of memories and nostalgia. Gradually, they began to move along familiar streets. The cobblestones under their feet seemed to know them, each step awakening memories of happy days when the world seemed so simple and carefree. Finally entering the house, Elwana was horrified to see that some of the furniture was gone, as well as the portrait of the family, and most likely the people got rid of everything that was broken. All this time, Prince Khazar and his assistant were watching Elwana. They saw the warlike Sunny next to the girl and realized that they had disguised her as a servant. 6 of the best knights accompanied the children, and the young men assumed that it seemed that Elwana really was his biological daughter, since under such protection, no one would be able to attack her. However, Khazar understood that they had to be on guard because the Regis ceremony was cancelled, and who knew what the Empress would do in anger. But the prince seemed not to have heard the words of his assistant and was fascinated by the appearance of Lady Elwana. It was as if he couldn't take his eyes off the sweet, charming lady he hadn't seen for a long time. Surely they would soon be destined to see each other, but for now Elwana did not even suspect that the 4th prince would be nearby all this time. A few days later, the funeral was announced, and Elwana, along with her brother and Sunny, went to the funeral ceremony. The heroine knew that the funeral was fake, and when she saw in the coffin exactly the same person as her father, she could not believe her eyes. The Duke and his men managed to find a very similar person, and the people around him had to play their part as if the funeral was really real. There were people at the ceremony that Elwana had never seen before, and they were all the Duke's stooges. And when Elwana saw her father's name on the tombstone, she finally knew it was time to say goodbye to him for real. A family friend approached Liana and admitted that he was very glad that the lady and baby Louis were all right. Louis handed the man a model of the ship and asked him to give it to Hans, being sure that he would definitely like the gift. This ship was truly special, and the man knew that Hans would truly appreciate it and be very happy. Louis finally got what he wanted. Ring approached the boy and asked the gentleman to leave the ceremony with her because they had been there for a long time. It was a fake funeral, and although there was a masquerade atmosphere around, a real storm of emotions raged inside her. Elwana took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, but the image of her father did not leave her mind. She remembered his bright smile, his laughter that rang out like a melody in any home. Even now it seemed that he was nearby, that you could hear his voice calling on her not to lose hope. She sat down near the tombstone and began to tell her that everything had worked out well for her, and that the Duke was looking after them, and that she was completely safe with the Spes family. She knew that her father always wanted Louis to be safe, and now Elwana had no other choice, and this was the only way to protect herself and her little brother. This bond was unbreakable, and she knew that even if he was not physically around, this love would live in her heart forever. But now the time had come when she needed to be strong for herself, and Elwana promised that she would always follow the bright path, never giving up on her dreams. Once upon a time, her father and mother lived in separate rooms, and they both worried every time little Elwana said she wanted a brother or sister. And one day the parents began sleeping in the same room again, and Elwana remembered how incredibly happy she was when, sometime later, baby Louis arrived. She continued to tell her father how Louis had grown so big, and all his teachers said that this boy was a real genius. Elwana promised that she would always take care of his son, and thanked Louis's father for always taking care of them. And she felt that for her, Ranvita would always be a real father, and she spent her entire childhood with an incredibly kind and noble man. At that moment, she realized that love truly has no boundaries or time. Lady Sunny had been standing next to Elwana all this time, but in an instant she felt a strong sense of excitement and began to act cautiously. She screamed for the lady to turn around, and it seemed as if the lady was in great danger. The lady just stood there, but a sharp dagger was flying towards her back, and Elwana felt that something strange was happening. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a sharp dagger fell at her feet, and the lady wondered where it could have come from. But right in front of her there really was an object that had just mysteriously appeared. As soon as Elwana looked up, she saw in horror that dozens of sharp metal daggers were flying straight towards her. Elwana already knew how to handle small metal balls, but sharp daggers were flying straight at her, and now the heroine has to feel and use her enormous power right now.